Learning is complicated and kind of stressful sometimes, especially when you're sacrificing your sleep, your hobbies, your friends or your family, or just the bliss of not needing to study. I would know. I'm Dr. Justin Sung and I'm no stranger to studying. In fact, in my first year of university, I memorized this textbook, as in almost every single page. And if that was it probably would have been okay. I made over 4,000 flashcards that year, and I studied an average of 120 hours per week, which meant I was only getting around 3 to 4 hours of sleep per night. I didn't take weekends, I didn't take holidays. In fact, in that 1 year, I actually studied more than most students would have studied in their entire life combined. But I guess it worked out for me because I entered into medical school, I did become a doctor, even got my own little fancy doctor stamp with my name on it. That's fun. But there were some issues that I realized once I entered into medical school. And the problem was that med school was way harder than I thought. It wasn't going to be possible for me to study 20 hours a day anymore if I wanted to maintain even semi-reasonable grades when there was literally double to triple the amount of content that I would have to study. So I researched and I read papers, I read thousands of research articles, and I experimented almost endlessly. Any technique that you can think of, I tried it. Probably dozens of times, in fact, and slowly but eventually I got there. And I was able to reduce my hours of study from around 100 hours a week to around 10 hours a week, with no change in raw intelligence. Purely through learning the skills and the techniques, I was able to reduce my studying time significantly. And I was doing just as well. In fact, I was doing even better. I had so much more time that I was healthier and happier overall. In fact, during that time at university, on top of studying, I set up 2 businesses, helped found one of the university's largest student clubs. I picked up new hobbies. I went to the gym. In fact, I even competitively powerlifted. I learned to dance, got proper sleep, and most importantly for you, I taught what I had learned to other students. And I taught students again.
Hey, it's Justin here, and today we're talking about...
And again, and again. And after teaching thousands of students for almost 10 years, now I'm here to teach you. So why wait? So go get some pen and paper or a Word document or something, because we're going to start with some fundamentals of learning theory and some of the techniques that I think every student should know. So feel free to pause this video while you get that and you get all set up. And then once you're set up, we will start getting going. You can unpause this video. So let's first understand a little bit more about memory and how human memory works. When we talk about memory, scientists usually divide it into 3 different stages. The stages that we're focusing on is the step going from working memory to long-term memory. And that process is called encoding. Now, what happens when we learn is that information comes in as sensory information. This is just something that you might be reading or listening to. So right now, when you're watching this video, that's sensory information that you're getting. And it goes into sensory memory. Now, your brain's ability to process sensory memory is very rapid, and your brain's ability to forget it is also very rapid. So after understanding what's being said, after reacting to a car moving towards you, after seeing an animal walk by, it's processed by your sensory memory, and then it's straight away forgotten. In fact, so quickly that you don't even remember remembering it. In order for us to actually put that into our working memory, it needs to be a little bit more relevant. We need to then do something with it. Now, everything that we do with information comes from our working memory. So we retrieve it from our long-term memory and we use it through our working memory. So this is a very important step. When you're answering an exam or a test paper, it comes through your working memory. Now, the thing is though, usually students are very bad at the process of encoding the information from working memory to go towards the long-term memory. And so this is problematic for a number of reasons. The first of which is that it reduces the amount of retention, which increases the amount of revision that you need. So for example, if everything that goes into your working memory is forgotten except for, let's say, 50% of it, which research would suggest is actually an overestimate, with most students forgetting over half of what they learn. But if we try to be optimistic and say 50% of everything in working memory is encoded into long-term memory, then that means we have to start all the way from the beginning at sensory information, bringing the information back to the working memory, and then again trying to encode it into the long-term memory. So we have to go through this entire process multiple times just to take in the information that we've forgotten already. This is why you can study something and after you've learned it, you still feel like you don't really know it. A week later, you've forgotten half of it. You have to go back through your notes, read them again and again and again. And this is a very repetitive process. Now, for the modern student, this is a problem because the curriculum is usually packed full, which means that if you're spending time to relearn material that you've forgotten, you often don't have time to learn the material that you're learning on that day properly. And in university, this becomes a huge challenge, which is the reason why a lot of top achieving students at the high school level fail to get those same results at university, because the volume of content increases so much. So if everything you learn, you need to repeat it 3 to 5 times for it to stick, then that becomes very time consuming very quickly. But there's another aspect of this, which is called retrieval. And retrieval actually produces a lot of learning. So it's not just the act of pulling something from long-term memory and bringing it into our working memory. It's actually consolidating that pathway. So the more times we retrieve, the stronger our knowledge becomes. But again, it depends on what was encoded in the first place. If there isn't a lot encoded to begin with, we don't have much to retrieve. So yes, it consolidates the information we did learn. However, it means that we're still limited by what we encoded. So hopefully you can see that there's this balance here. On one hand, we need to encode in such a way that lots of what we learn goes from our working memory into our long-term memory so that we can retrieve it either during revision or for our tests and exams. And it's this balance of good encoding with frequent retrieval which produces really effective and efficient learning where you're not spending all this time constantly repeating and revising and rereading your notes, and you are getting those grades at the top level by studying less. And these are some of the changes that I made through that decade of trial and error so that you don't have to. Which actually brings me to another really important point. See, the process of going from working memory to long-term memory and then back and then forth, this encoding retrieval cycle is actually cognitively, and when I say cognitively, I'm talking about what goes inside your brain, quite difficult and challenging. It doesn't feel comfortable. There is a level of difficulty associated with that, and that difficulty can be perceived by us as confusion or maybe just trying to get your head around something. If you ever felt the discomfort of trying to figure something out or trying to remember something that's just on the tip of your tongue, that type of difficulty is actually an inherent part of encoding and retrieval. So what that means is that if you don't feel that, if it feels like when you're studying it's easy and it's comfortable and it doesn't take too much effort, it means what you're doing is you're not encoding and retrieving properly, which actually means you're not getting learning, which is the worst situation because it means that you feel like you are studying effectively, but in actual fact, you're not holding on to that information. And so this is a really good indicator that we can use for ourselves. When we are studying, it should feel a little bit difficult and uncomfortable. And if it doesn't, there's a strong chance, almost a guarantee in fact, that it means that the way that you're studying is not correct. Now, obviously, it's the right type of difficulty that we want. We don't want to just be randomly studying upside down, with, half of our clothes hanging off from a pull-up bar. That's unnecessary difficulty. That's not going to help us with our learning. Well, at least I don't think it's going to help with the learning. But don't try that. The type of difficulty that we do want is the cognitive difficulty that comes with trying to encode and retrieve in an effective way. And so all the techniques that we teach you in this course are going to be based around increasing your ability to either encode or increasing your ability to retrieve, as well as the note-taking, listening, and reading skills associated with that. And it can at times get quite complicated, but we will do it step by step so that you will build the foundations first and you will eventually be able to do this very smoothly and very seamlessly. And so the best place to start is with these 3 fundamental rules of learning. And when I say rule, it's different to a technique because these rules apply almost universally. Whatever technique you're using, these rules will apply for. When we teach you other techniques, keep these rules in mind. Always try to apply these rules. And I say this now right at the beginning before you've even started the course properly because you need to be aware of this because we're not always going to repeat it. Otherwise, it will get pretty repetitive pretty fast after every new technique saying, make sure to apply these 3 rules. From now on, you can assume that for virtually every technique, unless we explicitly say otherwise, and we can remember these rules with the mnemonic SIR, S-I-R. So we'll start with the first one. S stands for spacing. Now, a common form of spacing that lots of people know about is called spaced repetition. Spacing just means that when we learn something, we should learn it once, we should give it some time for us to forget a little bit, and then we learn it again. Now, if you're really thinking about this, you can see that this is allowing us to have multiple points of retrieval. And this is a good thing. Generally speaking, you should try to space your learning out. So this could look like pre-studying some material with a variety of pre-study techniques before class, and then going into class, and in class, consolidating it, asking questions. So that would have been a space. You may have learned it on one day, and then 1 or 2 days later, you go in class and you're learning it again, but this time a slightly different angle, and it means a slightly different thing because you've already gone through it once. And then maybe a week later, you go through it again and revise it with a different technique. Now, a lot of you will already be using spacing, in which case, good job. You've already got a fundamental. But a lot of people don't use spacing correctly or don't know about it. So that's why it's fundamental. If you're not using spacing, make sure to use it. And check below this to see some guidelines on how to apply spacing effectively and some ideas just to get you started. They're all very easy. The second rule is called interleaving. And interleaving means hitting some topic or a concept from multiple different angles. And when I say multiple different angles, there are a lot of ways to think about angles of learning. It could be taking a concept and asking yourself a question about it, and then asking a question that is slightly varied. It could be taking 2 different concepts and asking a question that relates both of them and links them to each other. For maths, it could be taking an equation and seeing if you can create a question that puts it in context, like a real-world application. For English, it could be writing an essay or creating a very challenging essay question for you. With interleaving, the idea is that there is something that you want to learn, which is in the center, and then there is this range on either side of it that you also want to learn. And by learning something, not just directly in the way it was taught to you, but also by looking around it a little bit and learning it from multiple different ways, challenging yourself in different ways, and trying to retrieve the information or encode the information in different ways, either writing it out or drawing a diagram or both, or summarizing it or teaching it. All of these different forms of using the information is a form of interleaving. And interleaving is incredibly evidence-based, and there's lots of research to show that more interleaving produces better learning. And actually, this occurs across sports as well, which is where some of the original studies were done. People found that you're a better athlete when instead of just practicing your free throw from one point, you practice that free throw from above that line, or below that line, or to the left, or to the right of that line. And so, We will talk about interleaving more later on as a form of spacing to allow you to reconsolidate this, but see again below for some ideas on how you can incorporate interleaving into your learning, some ideas that you can take with you. And again, it's not a matter of whether you do it right or wrong, because interleaving is easy enough to do as long as you do it. The biggest issue is that people often don't do it to begin with. And the third thing, R, stands for retrieval. And obviously, retrieval is talking about taking information and recalling it from your long-term memory. And there are multiple ways of retrieving. And again, we'll have some ideas in the text below on different retrieval techniques that you can start using straight away. But again, all of these fundamentals apply for other techniques. So for example, let's say we teach you a mind map technique. In that case, you want to apply retrieval as much as possible. So by drawing a mind map and maybe using symbols or diagrams instead of words, that's a form of interleaving your learning. But if we read the passage of text, we try to turn it into a diagram or a mind map, and then we try to make that mind map from memory. That is using both interleaving and retrieval. And that combination is always a great pairing. So whenever you're reading notes, don't just read and write straight away. Always give yourself a gap for retrieval. Read it, think about it, hold on to it, cover it up, then write your notes. And when you're writing your notes, experiment a little with different ways of using the information. Turning words into an image requires a different part of your brain. This increases your level of learning and improves the rate of encoding that occurs, which obviously, when you retrieve it, makes it easier because there's more to retrieve. So hopefully you can see how retrieval fits in everywhere. So look at the way that you're studying and look for opportunities for retrieval. Before class, if you're pre-studying, do you read, wait, and retrieve before you write? How much do you retrieve? And how frequently? You want to make it as frequently as possible. When you're sitting there in class, how often do you retrieve? Do you listen, think about it, process it, and then put your notes down? Or do you write as they are talking? Again, this is another form of retrieval. When you combine spacing with interleaving and retrieving as much as possible, your learning will start going up. Now again, these are very fundamental ideas, and it's not a unique idea either. In fact, pretty much any educational psychologist or anyone that knows anything about studying efficiently will know about the ideas of spacing, interleaving, and retrieval. So these, again, are just the fundamentals, and we will be building on this as you learn more and more advanced techniques. But just always remember, whatever technique we teach you, you can always find a way to space it, interleave it, or retrieve it. And if you can't, we will tell you that this is not suitable for spacing, interleaving, or retrieving. Again, we're going to revisit a lot of these concepts throughout the course. We're going to look at more advanced variations of it. We're simply going to teach you it again, but in a different way. Just in case you missed it, you'll be able to reconsolidate your knowledge and make sure that you don't have a huge gaping hole in one of your 3 fundamentals. And just to finish off with an example of how we know that this works, you actually have plenty of examples in your own life where you learn through spacing, interleaving, and retrieving to maximize the encoding and retrieval of information from working memory to long-term memory in your daily life. Think about your favorite TV show, or book series, or movie, or maybe a hobby, an instrument that you play, a sport that you've played for a long time, a board game. Think about how much you know about that. Then think about how many notes have you written for that? How many practice papers have you done for that? Compared to how much you may have done for biology or maths or English or physics. Probably a lot less, if any. And yet your knowledge on it will be very fluid, with a high level of retention, and you'll be able to recall it almost instantly. And that's a great example where you take information in, and you'll usually revise that information in some kind of way. You'll use that information again. If it's an instrument, you use a certain technique while you're playing. If it's a sport, you practice it the next time you practice. You use it in your game. There is spacing there, but you don't use it the same way each time. Each note, each position when you're playing, each character that you read in a different scenario and the personality that you're learning about this character, it's being tested and shown to you. You're processing that information in a different way each time with slight variations. And that allows you to see not just what's in front of you, but you can get an entire idea of the concept that you're learning. And then because of the fact that you're usually not writing notes for it, this information is always retrieved every time it comes into play or is used. And as a result, you end up having a very high level of retention and recall for all of these ideas and concepts that you learned through TV or movies or books or games or sports or instruments without using any of your conventional studying techniques. And the techniques that we're going to show you that apply through academics allow your brain to learn in a very similar way as you would learn your hobbies. It makes it more enjoyable, it makes it more fun, it makes it more effective, obviously, but overall it means that you spend less time studying, and the way that you study is just easier and a lot more fluent, and the information you're able to process and recall at the end of that should come through much more quickly, much more instantaneously, less time wasted on re-revising, which ultimately all means your test and exam results will be much better while having more time available for you to get some more sleep. Welcome to the course. We're going to get started with some few basic principles that you need to understand about how learning works and different approaches to learning. Now, most of you probably have never even heard of different approaches to learning. You may have heard of different techniques, you may have heard of different strategies, you may have heard of spaced repetition or active recall or doing flashcards or different ways to write your notes, and those are all good and they're all techniques, and yes, they have their place, but actually there are some fundamental ways of looking at learning that actually make a very big difference, and many of the techniques that we teach throughout the mini course that you're about to go on to soon, as well as our full course, a lot of these techniques are based on different approaches to speed things up. So the way that we look at it is that instead of learning to ride your horse faster to win the race, what we're teaching you is that you could actually bring a car, in the analogy sense, bring a gun to a knife fight. And so we're trying to change the way that you view learning. So there's a few things that we need to understand. And the first thing that I actually want to talk about is the idea of learning through repetition and memorization, and why that is very unsustainable when it comes to not only learning when you're at the lower levels in high school, but especially so when you're in university or later years, and getting used to that system and getting really good at learning that way is not going to get you very far. So let's actually have a very quick look at what I mean here. So there's this very famous curve. It's called the forgetting curve, and we will talk about this a little bit more in the course as well. However, it says that when you learn something, let's say that's this blue dot, we learn something for the first time, we actually forget this information very quickly. And so our knowledge, which is on the y-axis, over time on the x-axis, reduces very, very quickly. And then if we were to repeat that information, let's say the green arrow immediately after that or shortly after that, our rate of forgetting the information would be a little bit slower. And then if we were to learn it again sometime later in red, we would actually forget it slower still. So obviously this is a good thing. We're able to learn something, and through repetition, or in this case spaced repetition, or more specifically because the gap between each repetition is increasing, this is expanding gap spaced repetition, we're able to increase our level of retention because we're able to hold on to this information more. Makes sense so far, right? Nothing wrong with this, and this is indeed a very good principle to use, and if you're not using this already, you definitely should be. However, there's a problem with this, in that it definitely requires this level of repetition, And it depends on this curve here. And so obviously, if we are forgetting things very, very quickly, then we are going to need to repeat it relatively soon in order to hold on to that information. And so if we're able to change this curve so that instead of forgetting it this quickly, we can actually shift this curve up so that the first time we learn it, we're actually forgetting it much more slowly, then it means that we don't need some of these repetitions. We can actually repeat it much less and still have the same level of retention at the end of the day. And so a lot of the time spent studying is actually wasted because that time is spent on simply repeating and relearning the things that we've already forgotten. However, when we look at this, we will quickly realize that that is not sustainable. And the reason is because of something called the Leitner system. So the Leitner system is a method of spaced repetition that allows us to prioritize the information that we forget more often. So for example, let's call this box number 1, box number 2, and box number 3, and box number 4. We take a piece of information that we've learned the first time, and we might repeat this initially, let's say 4 hours later. And if we get it correct, then we would repeat it again later, let's say 12 hours later. So this gap is 12 hours. And then we repeat it again, and then this gap is now, let's say 24 hours, and then we repeat it if we get it correct one more time, and then the next time we repeat it, maybe it's 1 week away. But then what happens if we get it wrong? So if we get it wrong, we actually go back a box. So at any point, if we get it wrong, we go back a box. So if we got it right at the beginning, after 4 hours, then 12 hours later, we need to repeat it again. If we get it wrong, then it goes back and we need to do it again in 4 hours. If we get it right, 12 hours later, we get it right again, and then we repeat it again in 24 hours. We get it wrong, then we need to repeat it again in 12 hours. We get it wrong again, we need to go back to 4 hours. So you can see how information has the potential to just constantly go back and forth between these boxes without you ever having effectively cleared it. Because you want to get to the point where you don't have to repeat it for at least the next few months, or at least until your exam or assessment. Otherwise, you're just going to continue accumulating more things to repeat. Now, the Leitner system is often talked about when it comes to flashcards, but it's actually the same for basically any other type of revision that is based on memorization. When you repeat something, you need to get to the point after repeating it that the gap between the review that you've just done and the next review is after your test or exam. Otherwise, by the time you set your test or exam, you may have forgotten that piece of information. When we look at it this way, we can see that information has the possibility to constantly flicker between these boxes so that every day we're adding new information from class or lectures that we are learning. And because we are forgetting very, very quickly, initially, it means that we're getting a lot of these wrong. And because we get a lot of them wrong, we're not able to progress and clear them sequentially. So the rate at which we get new information that we need to repeat is faster than the rate at which we can clear them. So 1 week later, instead of having just that week's worth of information to repeat, and then the week after that being clear of that and having the next week's worth of information, we may end up after 2 or 3 weeks having a full 2 or 3 weeks worth of information we are needing to repeat on maybe a single Saturday, which becomes not viable. And as time goes on, it gets harder and harder to hold on to this information. The retention actually ends up going down because now we're even more overloaded, and it forms this negative spiral. So we have less time to study because we're spending so much time relearning the stuff that we are forgetting from previous study sessions. And then because we have less time to study, we're less able to retain the information we're learning now, which means that a week from now, we're going to have even more stuff that we forgot, which means that 2 weeks later, we're going to have even more that we need to revise. So it continues to build and build. And this is often why students that use systems like this that don't fundamentally change the rate of forgetting, these students who don't change the rate of forgetting and still forget things very quickly and struggle with this kind of constant re-revision, they will struggle in later years of high school or in university, especially when it comes to competitive degrees where everyone is an excellent student and now you have to be excellent among the excellent. A lot of the times people will fall off on the academics, which previously may have been their strength, because of the fact that they're using a system of studying that's mathematically not viable. It does work for some people, but the amount of time it takes is a lot. And also, you have to be a little bit lucky in that, thousands, if not millions of students will be studying with this kind of strategy. For the majority of these students, it's not going to allow them to achieve at the top level. And for the minority of students that do, they probably have an approach to learning that allows them to fundamentally shift this line so that our rate of forgetting is slower, so we actually don't need as many repetitions. So to summarize, spaced repetition is good, lateness system is good, but if we're forgetting things very quickly because our approach to learning is very memorization based or very rote learning heavy, or we're spending lots of time studying, but after we finish writing our notes, we still don't have a clear idea about what we've written, then it means that we are setting ourselves up for sabotage later down the line, and that's not going to work. So we're changing the way that you're seeing that, and we're really going to be shifting your focus from this memorization focus of learning towards one that's a lot more sustainable and shifts that curve. So all the techniques that we teach later on in the course will teach you how to shift that curve fundamentally. But if this is the case, and there's actually other ways of learning, then there's a really interesting question that you have to ask yourself, which is, why is it that people only give tips on things like active recall and spaced repetition if all it's doing is helping you get better at a game that is already difficult to win? Why aren't people talking more about how to change the game entirely? Why aren't people talking more about how to shift this curve? Why do people only give advice on when to do these repetitions, how to do these repetitions? When to do it as spaced repetition, how to do it as active recall. And the reason is because people only give tips on what they know. And there is a lot of information out there. I'll be using the terms neuroscience and neuropsychology and learning neuropsychology throughout the course. When I talk about neuropsychology, we're really talking about the frameworks and theories behind how learning works. Whereas when we talk about neuroscience, we're talking about more at a physiological basis, neurotransmitters, neuroplasticity, and how neurons from a biological point of view allow the frameworks and theories of neuropsychology to play. When you look at the research in these fields, you'll find that there is a lot of findings on different methods and approaches to learning that are not at all mainstream, yet can be extremely effective. Now, most people don't know that simply because it's not already common, it's not taught in schools, most teachers aren't trained in this. In fact, most people, unless they're in educational research, wouldn't really know about this. And so even though the knowledge is out there, it's not like I'm summoning it from the universe myself directly, the information is there. However, it's kind of hidden behind a lot of research articles and things, and it's very difficult for a student like yourself to actually take that and do something meaningful with it, whereas something like spaced repetition or active recall, Pomodoro technique, these are things that you can learn straight away, you can apply straight away. Yes, they're effective, but again, it doesn't change the fundamental game. And unfortunately, because of the Dunning-Kruger effect, the level of confidence that people have that are giving advice tends to be reflective of overall a low level of knowledge. So if you look at this graph, you'll see that there is a really high level of confidence when you know a little bit, because compared to knowing nothing, that's a lot. However, as you start to learn more and more, you realize that there's so much more about this that you don't know. Your confidence goes down, and then it starts picking up again slowly over years and years of time, when you realize that actually you are becoming an expert across all these years. But this first point, this highest point of confidence, when there's not a lot of effort, this is actually called Mount Stupid. And so a lot of people are well-intentionally on Mount Stupid. They know a little bit about studying, they've had a little bit of experience, They've tried certain things before and they think, wow, this is the best thing ever. And they teach it and they're very, very confident about it. But actually they haven't spent years and thousands of hours working with students, looking at the research, experimenting with it, not only themselves, but with other students as well to see what works. So when we introduce some of these techniques to you, some of them will be easy, some of them will be hard. Keep in mind that when I use a technique and I demonstrate it to you, it may seem a lot easier when I'm doing it, but that's because I've spent over 10 years in this process and I've had a lot more experience down this journey. You can't expect to get this perfect straight away. You do have to spend a little bit of time to practice some of these techniques. Some of them you will be able to use straight away. Some of them will require practice, but that's where that hard work, effort, diligence, dedication really comes in. And at the end of the day, it's actually very logical to think about all of this, because if you're just studying the same way as everyone else and everyone is kind of giving you the same advice, then you got to wonder, how good can you possibly be by doing the same thing as everyone else? And so to help yourself free yourself from the Dunning-Kruger curve and know exactly how much you do know about it, a really simple activity that you can do is think about what conditions are necessary in order for your belief or opinion to be true. And I actually want you to do this activity with me. So there are a number of different beliefs that people have, and there are very specific conditions in which this belief would actually be true. So let's have a look at some of these. So there are a number of misconceptions that people have about learning and what it takes to be a successful student. And as someone who, I would say, I have been a successful student and have worked with a lot of students that were previously unsuccessful and transforming them to become successful, there are a few ones that I've picked as my favorites. And so let's do this activity together where we look at what are the conditions in order for these statements to be true. One of the first ones is, how good can you be by doing the same thing as pretty much everyone else? Well, in order for you to use the same techniques as everyone else and to perform significantly better than them, the conditions in which that must be true are that either you are very lucky or that you try significantly harder. Now, the lucky one is kind of stupid. We all know that we don't want to create a plan based on us being lucky. However, the effort one is a little bit more nuanced. So the thing is that the amount of effort you put in obviously has an impact on the results that you're going to get. However, when you're trying to get to a very top level of performance, let's say you're not aiming to be in the top 10%, but you're aiming to be in the top 1% or the top 0.1% or even less of students either locally or nationwide, especially if you're at university and everyone in your class was in the top 1% and you need to be in the top 10% of them. When you look at it in that perspective, then even if everyone tries their hardest, the way you try is actually going to make a massive difference. So, first of all, at those high levels, everyone is trying hard. So if you want to be 20% better than someone, but you can only try 3% harder, obviously the maths on that doesn't really stack up. But even if everyone is trying their best, people are going to have different results. And we see this very commonly with highly competitive degrees. We see this a lot with the medical field, people trying to enter into medical school. Everyone is trying extremely, extremely hard, and yet still only a very small percentage of those people will actually succeed. The reason is because it's less about the effort you put in, and it's more about the direction in which you're putting that effort in, so that when you put the effort in, you actually go in the direction that you want to be going. So the conditions for same techniques but different results to be true is either substantially more effort or you're just a lot luckier. So obviously that ends up being a misconception. The reality is that you can't really get that much better by doing the same thing as other people. Generally, people that perform better are doing things better, they're behaving better, they're studying differently, they're using different processes, and it could be as simple as the way they're writing notes, but often it is more complex and there's an entire system that's built around that. Another favorite of mine is that people have different learning styles. So in order for people to have different learning styles, for example, often people will say, I can't learn through reading and writing, or I can't learn through someone speaking to me. In order for that to be true, the condition that needs to be met is that your human brain is incapable of learning that way effectively. The truth is that the research shows, and is what many educational psychologists and researchers will comment on, is that the human brain is an incredibly powerful learning machine and is adept at learning in a multitude of different ways and in a multitude of different environments for a multitude of different disciplines. So, generally speaking, you can learn in virtually every style. However, the extension of this is that people do have different preferences and there are different things that you're trained at. But again, what the research shows is that those who train themselves at learning through multiple styles of learning and have stronger preferences for mixed mode learning rather than single focus learning, they consistently are able to outperform and get better exam and test results as well. Another assumption about learning is that most learning is done through rote learning or memorization. The condition for that to be true is that your brain is not capable of learning this material more effectively through anything other than rote learning and memorization. We know this is not true because you don't apply this method of thinking to anything else you learn in your life. If you learn hobbies or sports or play a game or watch a TV show or a movie or read a book, you have a very high level of retention on that, but you're not really studying it and you're not trying to memorize it. You naturally have a very high level of retention on it because you're using a different approach to learning. Some of those approaches I will be teaching you very shortly in the course coming up. So again, the condition for that to be true, we know it doesn't make sense. And again, what the research shows is that you can shift that curve so that you don't need to be rote learning and memorizing. It is possible to learn things to a very high level of retention and a high level of recall through other processes that are not pure rote memorization. Another common assumption, there's no other way to study other than the way that I'm used to or I've heard from seniors or friends or family friends or something like that. That's just frankly not true. We have hundreds of students that we work and have worked with thousands of students in the past where they are learning a different way and they are getting that top 1%, top 0.5% result, and they are using a different approach. And in a couple months from now, you also will be one of those people. You will see the light and you'll be able to do that. So you don't have to take my word for it. You can just apply the techniques and start seeing the difference for yourself. Or better yet, jump onto the Discord community, talk to some people that are ahead of you and hear it from them themselves how the way they're learning is fundamentally different to how they used to learn. There are other ways, and I personally used these other ways for a large proportion of my learning, and it worked for me a lot better and it's much less stressful, and these are results we're consistently able to get. So we can demonstrate that that's not true through purely the proof of our students themselves. And potentially one of my favorite assumptions to disprove is the idea that this is something that you can start picking up and getting better at instantaneously. Learning to study is a skill. Learning to study is a skill. It's a skill just like learning to play basketball. You wouldn't expect that someone can give you a basketball, explain to you how to do the technique, and then you can, within a few minutes, do the technique perfectly. You wouldn't expect that. In fact, you would expect that you would be pretty terrible for the first few weeks, maybe few months, maybe even few years of practice. Now, I'm not saying it's going to take a few years for you to get really good at these techniques, but I am saying that it does take time, it does take practice, it is a skill. You can't just read about it and then think, oh, I understand that, and therefore assume that you will be able to use the technique effectively. A lot of the time we get students who are coming in, using the course, they're going through and they're rushing it, they're understanding what they read, but they can't apply anything. They can't apply what they read because they haven't been actually practicing it. They don't have experience under their belt. So they're the person that has been reading about playing basketball and expecting they'll be good, and then complaining about the fact that they're not any good at dribbling or shooting or pretty much any aspect of the game because they don't have practice. So it is a skill. You can't develop it instantly. It does take time and commitment. And a lot of students have a mentality that you can just put a little bit of effort in and you will just get really, really good at it. that is not only underestimating and undervaluing the complexity of the skill itself. Something this valuable, this honestly life-changing, is something that does require an investment of effort as your personal payment for reaping the benefits of using a system like that. And it's also underestimating yourself and the effort that you are able to put in to get to something, your strength of character, your own level of diligence, your own strength of commitment and determination to achieve the goals that you want to achieve. If you have got goals that are ambitious, that you know are going to be challenging, it's going to take work. You know it's going to take work. You need to be prepared to put in that work to practice the skills that are going to get you there. And the most important aspect about going through this course is that you look at it in terms of the marginal gains that you get. And one more, potentially one of the most toxic, damaging assumptions of all, which is that the way to stop falling behind is to get more tutoring. And this is counterintuitive for a lot of people because they think, hey, tutoring is going to help me get better grades, but at what cost? So the way tutoring works is often access to more resources or access to someone explaining something to you in a way that's easier for you to understand. However, if you are at especially a high school level or even earlier, then this is incredibly damaging because the problem is not that you don't understand the topic. The problem is that you didn't know how to understand it. You weren't able to understand that piece of information. If someone else is explaining it to you, the question is, why didn't you understand that yourself? Why did you need someone to explain it to you? And so what happens is that tutoring becomes a crutch, and it leads to something that's well observed in educational research called the fade-out effect, where people will forego the development of their own independent studying skills and instead rely on tutors to facilitate their learning, which means that eventually one day when tutoring is not an option, which creeps up on people a lot due to either financial reasons or because tutoring is just not available, for example, in university, they really struggle. And what the research shows is that they struggle more than the students who didn't get any tutoring. So short term, there may be a benefit to tutoring because you're literally given these answers and resources. However, long term, it reduces your resourcefulness and your own ability to navigate the topic, think about these things, and create your own learning, which is actually why we discourage students from getting tutoring, especially at a high school level, because overall what we've found is that it makes things worse. So we have a lot of experience working with university students, and what we find is that consistently the students in university that perform the worst and struggle the most, they are actually the ones that got the most tutoring at a high school level. So what's the condition in order for tutoring is the answer to me not falling behind being true? The only way that that works is if tutoring is something that you can always rely on, and the only other thing is that the reason you're falling behind is a lack of explanation or information or resource. But most of the time, the reason you're falling behind is because you didn't have the skill to keep you up to date yourself. So it's really fixing like a symptom, not the cause. It's better to fix the cause, learn the skills that's going to keep you on track, and then you're not going to need tutoring. So the stuff that we teach is going to stop you from falling behind with your schoolwork. It's going to make sure that you are on track. If you are worried about falling behind, about overwhelming assignments and tests and study and homework that you need to do, using these techniques is what allows you to escape from that endless grind and become a little bit more free with your time because you're able to study faster than the rate at which they can give you more things to study. And that's a very liberating feeling that I hope that all of you are able to feel as well by the end of this.
So it's time now to deepen our understanding of the concept of marginal gains. So we understand what marginal gains are and we understand why it's important. So you may be asking yourself, well then how does marginal gains apply to my subjects? How do I achieve marginal gains such that over time my exam results will be 100%? Or how do I achieve marginal gains for my time management? What does it actually look like? So there's a few characteristics of marginal gains. Now that we have a basic understanding of what it is, we can dive into a little bit more deeply, and this is going to help you identify your marginal gains for your subjects, whether it's maths, whether it's English, sciences, whether you're at high school or university, it doesn't really matter. It's all the same principle. So obviously one of the characteristic principles of marginal gains is that the gains need to compound. And by compounding, what I'm talking about obviously is the idea that it's not just a straight line going up, because if you were only adding 1% per day, for example, then after 365 days, you would only have 365% of gain, which is not bad, but it's a lot less than what we could be doing if we had compounding gains, right? And so the most common example, obviously, of a compound gain is the idea of compound interest. So if you're not familiar, the idea of compound interest goes like this, is that if you had, for example, $100 in the bank, and that was earning you interest of 1%. And let's just say that it's calculated at the end of every single month. So 1 month later, we would have 1% of $100, which would be $100 plus $1. That's 1%. And so therefore we would have $101. Now the next month we would have an additional 1% on top of that, but 1% of $101 is obviously greater than 1% of $100, and therefore it wouldn't be 101 plus $1, it would be 101 plus 1% of 101, which brings us to $1.01 in addition, right? Which is $102.01, right? And if we were to continue this trend, then what we'd see the next month is that we'd be at $103.0301, and so on and so forth, right? So you can see that the gap is increasing. Initially, the difference between the first month and the second month, I'll do this in red, this difference is only $1, and then in the next month, this difference here is $1.01, and then the difference between this month and this month is greater than that still, right? So obviously, the benefit is that as you continue to go, the gains you're making are higher and higher and higher, and so it creates this sort of exponential growth kind of graph here, where the gains you get at the very end are much greater. And so the thing was that 1% better per day across an entire year leads to a 3,600% increase, or 37 times better than you were at the beginning. Now, the only reason that compounding works, and the only reason that aggregation of marginal gains creates this compounding effect, is because when we make the gain, it changes the state. So what do I mean by changing the state? So when we add $1 to $100, it means that the current balance, the amount of money that we have, our current balance is now $101. So it's changed the state of our balance. It went from $100 to now $101, which means that when we add 1% more onto this, then it changes the state once again to $102.01. So the state is constantly changing. An example of this without the state changing would be if you had $100, you earned 1% of interest on this. So you've got $100 and you earn $1, that's fine. But let's imagine that this dollar now goes into some kind of separate account and it's locked away. And it's not included when we do the next 1% calculation. So the next time when we do 1%, because this amount here was locked away, it's still just 1% of $100, which is the one that we've got available. So now it's again just $100 plus another dollar. And then again, if this gets locked away again, then you can see that the state of our balance is not really changing. And so it's the same thing when we're looking at subjects and skills and other things like that, is that whatever gains we make, so the gains that we make need to change the state. So let's look at this a little bit more in detail. We understand the idea that in order for marginal gains to really be effective, we need to make sure that the gains we're trying to get are compounding. If we get gains that are simply just additive, in that it doesn't compound, it's more like it's more like this, where you're just getting a fixed amount better at something, then yes, you will get better, but it's not as good as you could be. But more importantly, there is still time and effort required, right? There's still time and effort required to make this gain. And so in that same amount of time and effort, we could have made a different type of gain that is compounding, and that would have had a much more powerful effect. And so even though on a daily basis it may not make much difference, let's say you spend 1 hour studying or doing something and that gives you a certain gain, if that gain was compounding, then we would see that over time, then we would have a much larger result. Whereas if instead that gain we made on that day was simply just additive, then on that particular day, there's not much difference. $1.01 is not much different to $1. But over time, because it continues to change the state, compounding gets better, whereas additive means that you have a very small effect, well, relatively small compared to the compounding. So because there's a time and effort investment into gaining whatever type of gain that you want, we want to make sure that whatever gain we do get is a compounding gain by nature, right? So let's put this in context with your school subjects. So we'll do an example of compounding gains versus additive gains, and we'll start with the additive gains. So these are the types of gains that you don't really want. So a great example of this would be something like just getting tutoring. So let's say that the goal that you're trying to reach is to get a really good exam result. Okay, and let's say we're aiming for a 100% exam result. Now, you can't say that getting a 100% exam result is the process that we need to look at, because if you want to get an exam result of 100%, it doesn't change your chances of getting the exam result just because you want it more. Nothing changes unless we change the way that we're trying to go about doing it. So for example, if you are trying to, let's say, make a hole in the wall, and you are punching it with your bare fists, then it doesn't matter how much you want to get through and make a hole in the wall, your hands will be bleeding and it'll be very difficult, and maybe you can succeed, but it's going to be very time consuming and very painful and a lot of sacrifice that was unnecessary. So we can still achieve the goal, but how much we wanted it didn't really make a difference. As opposed to if we were to think about, okay, what is the best way of achieving this? So even if our goal is getting an exam result of 100%, we need to think about what is it that gets us this exam result of 100%. We can't just want an exam result of 100% and just have it. We need to make sure that we've got good exam technique. We need to make sure that we've got accurate recall of details and information. We need to have a good conceptual understanding. And we need to make sure that we can use both of these in problem solving. And not just basic problem solving, we need to have a good grasp of basic problem solving, and we need to have a good grasp of more complicated, complex, or sometimes these curveball type questions. And not only that, we need to make sure that we're able to do this entire process at a certain level of speed, because our exams are usually time limited. So we actually need to tick off all of these things along the way in order to get this result that we want. And so we can say that if you had good exam technique, if you had great recall of details, great conceptual understanding, you were able to use that all to solve problems of all ranges of complexity, and we're able to do this at speed, you would expect naturally that this person is going to get a very good result at the end of that, right? It's a natural outcome. It's a natural consequence. So wanting the exam result of 100% doesn't change anything. However, ticking off all of these things along the way does allow this to occur naturally. Remember, your grades are an indicator of your ability to study. When you have a high ability to study, naturally that transfers to a high level of knowledge, plus a high ability to recall and use that knowledge. And that equals a high exam result, right? Our exam result is an indicator. Just like how your speedometer shows you how fast you are driving a car, the exam result teaches you how well you are studying and how good this process is, in the middle here. So we need to actually focus on this bit here. This is the process which leads to the outcome. So when we look at it this way, it becomes really clear what are additive marginal gains and what are simply, which are compounding gains. So one example of an additive gain would be something like tutoring. If you get tutoring, then what tutoring can do is it can directly give you more resources, and it can also give you a little bit more guidance and instruction, obviously the actual teaching itself, and that can give you, so I'll add teaching on top of that, and this can give you an increase in your amount of knowledge, which and your ability to apply this knowledge, and therefore that can increase your exam result, right? So at this point, we're thinking, so this seems like a pretty good deal. This seems like a pretty good deal. But now we need to think, did it change the state? And in this case, what we're talking about is the state of you. You are the balance. You are the amount of money. When we're making gains, we're trying to think about the processes behind it. So in order to know whether it changes the state, then we simply think about, what if we didn't have this anymore? Well, if we didn't have this, we would have less resources, less guidance, and less teaching. In that case, would we still have the same amount of knowledge and our same ability to apply it? A lot of the times the answer is no. And if the answer is yes, the tutoring doesn't actually, doesn't make any difference, and the question is, well, why are you even getting tutoring? Unless you just like wasting money. But most of the time the answer is no. The tutoring is providing this direct increase in the ability to apply information and our knowledge of it. So when we take away the tutoring, we are no different. We have not changed our state. We're like a level 1 character with level 6, weapons and, I'm spelling that wrong, weapons and armor, and that is allowing us to, tackle things that are level 5, for example, okay, as a little gaming analogy. However, we are still at this level 1. So when we take away all this tutoring, it means that our knowledge and our ability to apply it will reduce, which means that our exam result will go down as well. So what that means is that later on, when content starts increasing, when the exams start becoming more challenging, and when the results we're aiming for, so our goals become higher. So for example, if you're aiming for top 1% goals, and previously you were happy with just getting top 5%, then because our state hasn't changed, we're now a level 1 trying to tackle a level 10, maybe. And so we need to have more and more and more and more and more tutoring, and so we become more and more reliant on it. And then at a certain point, it's just not enough. The bottleneck is no longer how much resources or guidance or teaching that we have. The bottleneck is how much our brain can hold and the amount of time that we have available, as well as the amount of time we have to do homework or assignments or labs or group projects or whatever else you're filling your time with, or simply just enjoying life and not studying. So that becomes the bottleneck. We become the bottleneck because our state remains too low. And so what that will do is that as these things all get harder, this will eventually lead to failure. So that will be an example of an additive gain. We are temporarily in the short term getting a gain, but it's not changing the state of us. And therefore, even though it can temporarily short term increase the result, long term it's actually far more detrimental to us. Another example of an additive gain would simply be just the amount of hours that you're studying. So if you're studying for 1 hour, and then that gives you a certain result, let's just say it gives you an 80% result, and then now you're studying for 2 hours, and then that gives you a 90% result. So this is good, and increasing the hours of study can improve your test and exam results. The graph of it actually looks a little bit like this, where after a certain point, if you increase your hours too much, then your exam results actually start dropping off. That your exam results actually decline when you study too much, and that's because you get more stressed, your efficiency starts going down. your performance overall just starts going down. But overall, if you're not studying much and you study a little bit more, your results are going to be better. So in this case, we've got another gain. We have increased our exam result from 80% to 90%, and we've increased the amount of time we're investing from 1 hour to 2 hours. So again, does this change our state? Well, it doesn't change our state, because if we go back to studying for 1 hour, then we can expect that our result would have just gone down as well. So that means, again, same thing, when the challenges start getting harder, again, our only solution here is to just add on more and more hours, which at a certain point, it can work for a while, but then at a certain point, it starts compromising on our sleep, our social life, our hobbies, other things that we enjoy, friends, family, all of that sort of stuff. And then that will start declining. So again, this is an additive gain where short term it can make an improvement, and some students truly don't study enough, but long term it's not going to get you there. And so in reality, we do need to have a combination of some additive gains and marginal gains. You can't always have only these compounding types of gains. So what's an example of a compounding gain? You may have realized that a lot of these things that we've talked about, these are very common. Most students will think, study more hours. And again, it does help for a little while, but it's not sustainable. A lot of students will rely on tutoring, and again, it does help short term, but actually there's even research showing that the more tutoring you get, especially at a younger age, the worse you actually do later on, and people consistently underperform later when things get harder, when they rely more on tutoring. And in fact, the top achieving students actually receive less tutoring overall. So what's an example of a compounding gain with regards to your subjects? Well, if we look at this here, we know that these processes that we've talked about, these are all things to do with our skills. So for example, exam technique, that's clear how that's a skill, but our ability to recall details. So there are certain skills and techniques in our brain that occur that will increase our ability to recall details. Yes, increasing the number of hours we spend on memorizing will help us recall details as well. But again, this is purely just additive. However, if the way we are spending that time changes, then the amount of time that we spend might stay the same or even reduce, but our ability to recall details may actually go up. So there are skills involved in recalling details. Again, the same types of skills involved in understanding concepts. Can we understand concepts faster? Can we understand things more easily? Okay, can we make it easier for ourselves? Can we solve problems more efficiently? Can we make it easier for us to use our knowledge to solve these problems across this range of different topics? So you can see, in that case, the state is fundamentally changing. We are changing because the processes that we're using are changing. We don't have to change the number of hours. We don't have to change the amount of effort necessarily that we're using. We don't have to rely on tutoring to give us the gain. What we are doing is we're taking the same person, us as the student, and what we're doing is we're enhancing our state so that when we apply the same amount of hours, effort, and no tutoring, the output that we have has gone up. It started from 80, but now because we're more efficient, we've brought it up to 90 and then 100. So the way that you achieve marginal gains with regards to your subjects is by relying on developing these skills. So for example, if you get a little bit better at recalling the details, your skill is better at recalling the details. Well, you may have 5 different subjects that you're studying that you need to recall details for. If you increase your ability to recall details without increasing the amount of time you need to spend by 1%, that means that you are getting that same benefit across all 5 of your subjects. So it's really the same as like a 5% increase, right? If you increase the ability to understand concepts more quickly by 1%, again, that's actually increasing across all of your subjects by a total of 5%. So you can see how these scale more and more and more. And unlike something like getting more tutoring or hours spent studying, if we are 1% better at understanding concepts, then if we were to get 1% better on top of that, then you can see that that is taking us in an exponential curve. So if our ability to understand concepts started at 100, If we were 1% better, we would be at 101. And then 1% better than 101 would be 102.01% better, right? And then we can get 1% better at understanding concepts again, okay? And then that would bring us even higher and higher and higher, and so on and so forth. Just like compounding interest, we would start going up. Same thing with recalling details. If we're 1% better at our ability, the skill of recalling details, then when we get 1% better on top of that, it's allowing it to compound. And you can see how you can't say the same thing about tutoring. If tutoring is providing us let's say tutoring is providing us a 10% benefit, is it possible to get 10% better at tutoring? So if we're starting at 100 and then that brings us to 110, does 10% more tutoring make it, more than that? Does 10% more tutoring bring us to, 1%. If we get 1% more tutoring on top of that, would that be 101.1? Probably not, because if we get 1% more tutoring, we're simply just getting one more. If we get another 2%, it's another 2 more. So it's just adding on. It's not like the more tutoring we get, the benefit of it increases exponentially. Likewise, the number of hours that we spend, it's not like spending more hours increases exponentially. In fact, it's actually the opposite. The more tutoring the more hours we spend studying, the benefit actually starts to plateau and even go down eventually, which is directly the opposite of compounding. So it's really important to understand a few of these concepts. Let me just do a quick recap. We talked about the idea of something called an opportunity cost, right? The opportunity cost meaning that it takes time, it takes effort, and it takes sacrifice to get a gain. And we can choose to spend that time and effort getting an additive gain, which is nice maybe right now, but probably isn't enough for us later on. Or we can spend that same amount of time and effort to get ourselves a compounding gain. And so if we get an additive gain, then we may get a linear increase in our performance until a certain point where it's not enough anymore, and in some cases it even declines. Or with a compounding gain, we may have an initially slower increase, but eventually it will vastly overtake what was possible with an additive gain, usually by multiple folds. And when it comes to your subjects, what that looks like is developing your skills a lot more. So, for example, if you're looking at how do I get 1% better with my maths skill, which is going to allow me to get my exam result of 100%. Well, in that case, you need to have a 1% better improvement in your exam execution. You need to have a 1% better in terms of your study scheduling. You need to have a 1% better in terms of your ability to understand the concepts, the ability to solve problems, so on and so forth. Likewise, for a topic like English, the 1% increase understanding of the text, being able to write an essay, being able to interpret the question, so on and so forth, etc. There's multiple other things that we'd need to make sure that we are able to do very well to get that 100% exam result. For sciences, no different. We need to be, again, good at our exam. We need to be good at those details. We need to be good at those concepts. We need to be good at our scheduling. So you can see how if you were 1% better at these things, it actually starts to stack up. If at the end of every week we're just 1% better than we were the previous week, then by the time we set our exam at the end of the year, we would be, a lot better than we were at the beginning of the year. Maybe not 3,600% better, but a lot better nonetheless, and it would make a significant difference. And the benefit of this, again, two-pronged, is that the time taken to, let's say, get tutoring for sciences, that's not going to make you better at maths or English, whereas the time taken to get better at your exam technique, that will allow you to get better at your exam technique in maths and English as well, wherever that is, essay, for example. The time taken to understand the techniques necessary to recall details or memorize more effectively or understand difficult concepts more easily and at a deeper level, that again translates through to other subjects. And in fact, you may be surprised to realize that the techniques that allow you to understand concepts in science actually can allow you to understand topics and concepts in English more effectively as well. And that's often a very big surprise to a lot of students, because science and English are obviously very different subjects. But actually, even though the concepts themselves between science and English are very different, when it comes to the skill of learning the concepts, that skill is actually very similar. So it's kind of like saying, yes, even though science is like, let's say, blue paint, and then English is like yellow paint, and so the colors are very different, the technique used to paint is very, very similar. Is the same technique used to paint. It's just that the colors are different, but the technique before that is very, very similar. So again, that 1% improvement in concepts actually means that you're getting a 2%, 3%. It stacks. If you've got 5 subjects, 6 subjects, 7 subjects, you're getting a 5 or a 6 or a 7% improvement from having that 1% better increase in concepts. But again, it is slower at the beginning, and then it starts to really compound, and then that's when it is a much better idea compared to just these additive gains, which eventually will plateau out and even go down over time, whereas your compounding gains continue to go up and up and up and up. Right? So if you're going to spend time and energy anyway, this is how you need to think about it. Don't think about the outcome, like the exam result. Think about the processes related to that. And then in order to get a good result for this exam, we need to compound our gains through developing these better skills, because the exam result is simply a reflection of your skill level. When you've got the skills, you've got the exam result. And you can imagine it's almost illogical to think someone can have great exam technique, a great ability to recall details, great conceptual understanding, great problem solving, can apply it at speed and under pressure, and great anxiety management and great time management and no procrastination. It's hard to imagine a person like that not getting this top type of exam result, right? And I think you can all agree with that. So it's about how do you 1% at a time make yourself become that type of person that is able to get this type of amazing result. How do we change the state of ourselves so that we can become this type of person? And that's how we apply marginal gains. And the most successful students understand and embrace these concepts. So with that in mind, have a look at how you can break down the subjects you want to get better at, and what are the skills you need in order to achieve it. Look at where you are right now and think, what is the 1% gain I can make to turn myself and my skills into the type of person that I need to be? The final point that I'll end on here is that a lot of students will know what techniques they need. They are familiar with the skills or familiar with some of the techniques. But remember, it doesn't matter what you know. It's about what you do. So even if you know all of these techniques and know all of these skills, if you're not actually using it, it's not going to have any impact on your exam results. And there's a false sense of security that you can actually develop. And this is one that I've fell into the pitfall myself multiple times over the years, where I feel confident because I know the techniques, but then when I actually start trying to practice them and use them, it's actually much more difficult than I had expected. I would have thought it was very easy, but there are some nuances and subtleties with the technique that I didn't even know. So the idea is that you may know the skill and the technique, but you don't know what you don't know. Okay, you don't know what you don't know. So until you're actually practicing and using it as part of your skills regularly, then you may as well not know it. You may as well not know it. So especially in the fundamentals course where we're teaching you just the basics, a lot of students say, oh, I know this technique, and yet when I ask, well, are you using it? Are you applying it on a daily and weekly basis? And they're like, no, I just never really felt the need to. Well, in that case, you may as well not know, because you actually don't know how to use it, and it may actually be doing more harm than good, because you could actually develop a sense of false confidence, and that's where this humility and willingness to accept help actually comes from. So we've covered some really important points here, building on your basic understanding of marginal gains that we developed in that previous video. So go through, evaluate your marginal gains, and always keep this in mind, especially as you get later in the courses. What the course and the program is going to teach you. I understand that many of you will be eager to go through the course and see what the program has to offer, and because of just the nature and some of the limitations with online learning in this kind of format, it's not possible to show you very quickly everything that you're going to learn. And we don't want you to go and rush through the course and learn things haphazardly as you go. It's only going to make things much more difficult for you to improve. So this video is going to serve as a full overview and a primer for the main techniques that you will learn. It doesn't cover every single technique, and it certainly isn't going to be able to go through all of them in depth at all, and we're not going to be able to explain a lot of how to do things, but I do want you to have a good understanding of the types of things that we are thinking about, the perspective that we are coming from, why we teach you certain things at a certain time in a certain way, and also when you're going through the course and learning the techniques as you go, I want you to always refer back to this video so that you have an understanding about how that fits into the big picture of things. Just due to the nature of the program, and we're actually going to explain that a little bit further in this video, it's just not a effective and beneficial move for you to go through and learn, much later, more advanced concept without having a good understanding of some of the earlier things. It introduces more variables that increase the chance of error at something more basic. And so in order to prevent those issues from arising, but also satisfy your curiosity and help you get an understanding about your journey that you're about to undertake, I'm going to do my best to outline it in an appropriate amount of detail. Now, it's not necessary for you to have a solid understanding of everything that I talk about in this video. You can come back to it as many times as you want throughout your course progress, and as you're going through, things will start making more and more sense to you, even if it feels really overwhelming right now. And it probably will feel quite overwhelming, but by the time you're finished going through the program, you'll actually have a very good level of ability to be able to actually watch a video like this and know exactly what's being talked about and have the answers to all of these question marks that you might have the first time you watch it. And that's a very exciting process that I'm glad I can walk you through. So the first thing to start off with is by saying that learning is frankly a very complex thing. It's something that is often very underestimated in terms of how complex it is by a lot of the people that we work with. So in one example, I often have students that will come and ask me, what is the best way for you to write notes? And this is an incredibly simplistic question because it doesn't look at what note-taking is and the cognitive effects that note-taking can produce. Note-taking, if we look broadly at the research, is something that has been studied for decades, and we still frankly know very little about exactly what makes note-taking effective and what makes it ineffective. There are some techniques out there that have, in some cases, been shown to be very effective. Some ones that come off the top of my head are the Cornwell note-taking method, Zettelkasten note-taking, any form of note-taking that involves a lot of the softwares that we often use. You could even consider flashcards as a form of note-taking. All of these, in some studies, have been shown to be very effective. But then, if you keep reading, you start seeing more studies that show that it's not effective, and in some cases, actually detrimental. And so across the board, when we're trying to see what actually works, or is there something else going on, it's a very confusing and very muddy picture. And so it's very important that we don't oversimplify
learning. We shouldn't expect that it's going to be a very simple and straightforward thing to learn, because it's just frankly not. And if we start with that perspective that it's just about this technique and this technique, then it's going to be very difficult to improve and really learn the best techniques that you can use that will work the best for you and all of the different types of challenges you're going to find yourself in. But the thing is that we can't blame general public for thinking that learning is a little simpler than it is, because the research really struggles to address this. Those of you that are very familiar with learning research will know this, and those of you that aren't may learn this for the first time, is that we know, frankly, very little about how learning works in real-world practical settings. A lot of the research that was done around learning and around learning science only started in sort of the 1960s and 70s, especially the 70s onwards. And at that time, there were a whole bunch of schools of thought and theories around how learning could possibly work. And most of those have been shut down, and we don't believe those anymore. But it's a relatively new and recent field of development. But the problem is that learning is something that is almost impossible to directly measure and observe. We can observe someone's note-taking skills, and then we can observe the grades that they get. But now it depends on who marked it, how difficult was the assessment, what were they being assessed on, how difficult did they find it to learn it in the first place, how much prior knowledge do they have, how good was the teacher, how easy was the subject, how easy was the exam. All of these things and many, many more actually influence that relationship. So it's hard to find a one-to-one relationship where we see that one variable creates one effect. And so research needs that type of information to really progress smoothly. And that's the reason why medical research is something that can progress much more quickly, because we're always looking for biomarkers and blood tests and different scans that give us definitive answers about something. But the things that we can't observe, the same thing is the case for medicine as well. There are a lot of medical conditions and diseases that we know very little about because it's so hard to observe it. And without that observation, research is very difficult. So actually, the current research space right now is fairly early, very primitive in its understandings. And so what we know as practitioners and what researchers know through their practice is often decades ahead of where the real research publication sorts of sits in terms of what has been proven. And so there's this big gap that every good educator is going to know about, and it's called the research practice gap. It means that practice is always the thing that leads in front of research. Research will follow behind, sometimes in the span of decades. What we have done with the system that we have created is we started purely from the practice. We just looked at what are the issues that we face in real world settings and how can we fix them. Back in the day, when we were first developing the system, there was no attempt to sell it. We weren't thinking of marketing it. We weren't thinking of even teaching it to other people. All we wanted was a system that would work and deliver real personal results, not in a lab environment like 90% of the studies out there, not only for a specific type of subject, but for real pressures, studying multiple subjects in really difficult, time-pressured assessments, trying to get sleep, trying to have a social life. With all of these other things going on, we wanted a system that could work. And so that was the primary focus. We didn't care about publishing things. We didn't care about publishing more research. All we did is look at the research out there, extract wherever we could, read lots of books, read lots of articles, and then synthesize and consolidate all of that. And we spent several years doing that to create the system that we've created. And then the next step was, how do we teach that in a way that is effective? How do we teach that in a way that other people can consistently learn? And that was a struggle on its own. And luckily, well, obviously, because I'm here talking to you about this right now, we did find a way. We found a way that we're able to teach this system to new uninitiated people of all different levels of experience to a relatively high level of accuracy and consistency. And the results are fairly predictable. So based on the data that we've collected over the last 4,000 to 5,000 students across the last 2.5 years, we know that around 80% of the people that follow the program and follow the instructions will have the results that we predict. And we actually have found that 100% of the people that follow the instructions and the program as we have laid out will see a positive result. Although for a small percentage of those people, the magnitude of that result may not be as large as we had predicted, or it may take them much longer than we would have normally liked. And I think that's kind of an unavoidable part of delivering something in this way without having that real close one-on-one private coaching level interaction, because of the fact that there is variation in the human brain. And so trying to get something that works 100% for 100% of people is probably impossible. And 50 to 70 years from now, when the research does catch up, probably the way that we're teaching you to learn is going to be the way that everyone is taught to learn. It's just that it isn't mainstream right now, but it also means that for you, if you learn this, you have a considerable competitive advantage over just regular people who are still using very outdated methods of learning. So here's what I'm going to go through now. I'm going to lay out the big picture in terms of how we're thinking about learning, the techniques that we're going to teach you, how it all fits in together. So this is going to give you a good, big, broad overview without you having to skip through all the lessons and trawl through hours of videos to figure this out, because this is really what you're wanting to know. And then after that, I'm also going to go through some of the variations within that, as well as some of the considerations. So the things that we are thinking about each of these steps that you have to really watch out for. So that's going to be important. And we're also going to mention that it's not in the same order as what we're going to teach you. So I'm giving you the big overview right now, but we don't teach it to you starting from the beginning to the end. And that's because we realized very early on that that's not the best way to learn it. Instead, there are certain fundamental principles scattered across this entire system that should be developed first, that create kind of these big landmarks that we can bridge between, and then we layer on top of that in an asymmetric fashion until you get up to the full system. So you're not going to learn the perfect version of a single part and then the perfect version of the next part and the perfect version of the next part. Instead, what we're doing is we're laying a strong foundation across the entire board, filling in gaps, making sure that you're getting very good high yield gains in the early stages, and then developing that to the next stage and the next stage and the next stage and the next stage. And some of you will be a little bit better at this part, and some of you will be a little bit better at this part. But overall, we've found that most people tend to have at least a couple of gaps somewhere in the early stages. And having even one gap in the early stage can cause the entire system overall to actually crumble. And that's just because, again, learning is really complex, and we, cried blood and sweat and tears and things to create this system that actually really does work. And it's a careful construct in the way that you have to learn it to be able to use it consistently. The most challenging part about that from your point of view is that when you're going through the course, there are going to be certain things that we're going to teach you that you are legitimately just not going to have any idea why you need to develop a certain level of mastery at a certain thing. We will explain it to you, but you may not really necessarily believe it, or you may not really feel that that is true. And this is something that we call insight limiting. So insight limiting is when your own insight into the process limits your insight into the process. So you are really never going to know if something is relevant for something that's more advanced based on what you know, because you may lack the knowledge to see the connection. And there's really no way around that other than sort of having just faith and trust that it is related and it is important in the way that we explain, and putting aside your own sort of sense of overconfidence or whatever it may be that might make you skip that step. So that's something that you have to be really careful of. If you feel the inclination to sort of skip a step because you don't think it's relevant for you, just note it may be because you haven't learned yet the thing that will teach you why this is important for the later thing. And if you were to skip it, it's going to make it much harder, because one of the side effects of the way that we teach it is that because we're teaching it in terms of the foundational principles first across the board, if one part is lagging behind while the other areas are developing, that starts limiting your overall performance. Again, learning is complex and it's not something that we can observe. So in real practice, this is actually what ends up happening, is that if there's an area that is under practiced and then you have a more advanced version of a system and you have issues with it, and then you submit that to us for feedback and you ask us for help, which we always encourage that you should do. There's many, many ways that you can get help scattered throughout the program, 24/7 basically. When you ask for help, it's very, very, very challenging, even for a very experienced eye, to see where the problem originates from, because there are now so many more variables that are at play. It's not simply you're at this stage, therefore it could be, one of these 5 or 6 issues. It's these parts are at this stage, but this part might be at this stage. But we don't know that. We don't know which part is holding you back. All we have to go off is just your experience and the work we're able to see. And so when there are all these other things at play, it's incredibly challenging to actually problem solve that. So in this situation, not only is it very disheartening and very frustrating, but actually often it means that you have to then revert back to a lower stage of the course and then just start filling in again from scratch to see what was missed. And that process alone, just figuring out what the problem was, can take months. So the time benefit of skipping something and not practicing something for a few hours just because of the fact that you want to save those few hours could legitimately cost you months of extra time and just backtracking to figure out what was the thing that was missed. So please don't run into that issue. If you were to go 10, 20% slower than you would ideally like to go, you will probably end up saving 200, 300% time in just not making mistakes that cost you months to fix. And really want to make sure that that is clear. So the stage is set in such a way that each stage builds a foundation of knowledge in terms of understanding how learning works and therefore being kind of the mechanic of your own brain, as well as skills, which is practical, real things that you can actually do. Knowledge is understanding how you can do something and what you should do. The skill is being able to execute on that consistently. So there is a big difference between knowing something and being able to actually do it. And this is something that we, again, can't underestimate. You may learn about a certain technique and understand how to apply it, but if you confuse that with being able to actually apply it in the real world, that can cause a lot of issues. Again, because it's insight limiting, so you may not be aware of the fact that you don't have the skills because you think you have the skills because you understand it. So you should only ever verify your skills with real practice and real work that you've gotten feedback on. But the other very important foundation that we're building, which may be the most important foundation of all, is the foundation of experience. So not only is there knowledge, not only is there skill, but there's also experiences that we have to build as you're going through the course stage by stage. And these experiences are twofold. Number one is the types of mistakes and challenges that you will face. What we found through many iterations and close observation of our students was that if we lay things out in a way that is so step by step, with the examples and the explanations perfectly dialed in, we sort of surprisingly at the time found that people did worse at learning the system in the later stages. They really struggled when it became more advanced and when the academic pressures in the real world started getting more intense. And in the research, this phenomenon has actually been documented. It's called the fade-out effect, and it talks about how you need to have a certain level of difficulty in the earlier stages because it trains your brain to be able to manage that difficulty. And so one of the things that you'll find going through the program is that sometimes we teach you a technique that we know is restricted and limited in a certain way. And we expect and predict that you will make certain mistakes and have certain challenges. And that is actually deliberate. We want you to feel a certain type of challenge, and then we want you to do your best to overcome that challenge with the limited skills that we have taught you. And then I want you to be able to experience what type of mistake is made. And this is extremely valuable because when we get to the later stages, it means that, first of all, you're going to be able to learn the advanced techniques much more quickly because you have the experience of doing it the wrong way and the mistake to consolidate straight away. So you're going to be able to learn the advanced techniques much, much faster than someone that has never made those mistakes in the first place. But even more than that, the experience of trying to do something and challenging yourself and being uncomfortable is something that is actually unavoidable in the later stages. In the more advanced techniques, it's not cognitively possible to teach those techniques in a way that avoids difficulty, because some of the techniques induce difficulty by nature, because the cognitive effect that we're trying to activate is directly linked with the subjective perception of difficulty and lots of effort and confusion. So when that happens, you're either going to have the experience and the skills to take that confusion and turn it into something productive, or you're not going to have that experience and you're not going to have those skills, and then you'll really, really struggle because it's more difficult and it's more advanced and we don't have those foundational skills. So being able to manage that discomfort, manage that confusion, manage the sort of insecurity with not knowing exactly how to do a technique but pushing through anyway, and then reflecting on that process to improve, these are all things that are extremely important for your development in the medium to long term. And so as a result, there are certain elements that we know will make you make certain mistakes, and that is completely deliberate. So making those mistakes is actually you progressing through. People that don't make those mistakes find it very difficult to progress because things just don't make sense. They don't see the relevance because they don't have the experience under their belt. So a common question would be, how long does it take to go through this entire process, which I'm just about to start outlining for you? It takes on average around 4 to 8 months. And there is quite a lot of variation, especially in the upper end. It's rare for someone to be able to get a very high level of competency in less than 4 months. Less than 3 months is, I don't think we've ever had anyone that's been able to do it that quickly. But 8 months is very reasonable. For most people, you will start seeing very significant results within the 4 to 8 month period. And so that's a very safe estimate for most people. However, for some students, it will take much longer. So especially if you are not academically very strong, or you're a younger student that doesn't have as much academic experience, for example, if you're in junior high school, or, even for some students, later high school, if you're not like very, very academically invested, it can take 12 to 18 months, potentially even longer. It really does depend, because there are certain things that you need to as I've mentioned, you need certain experiences to consolidate certain things and really get your head around them. But with diligent, consistent work, it takes around 4 to 8 months. However, there are a few things that really affect this in a big way, and the two main things is practice and consistency. And I'm not just saying those as fluff words. I actually mean them in terms of very, very specific things. When we're talking about practice, there are two ways that we have found that when this is not done, progress is much, much slower. And that is, number one, which is the obvious one, not enough practice, assuming that you have the skill because you just understand the technique. That's probably the biggest one. But the second one is actually practicing in the wrong way. So practicing in the wrong way is a difficult thing to wrap your head around before learning some of the techniques. But again, because of the fact that learning is complex and it's impossible to really directly observe it, there are many ways that a technique can be interpreted. So we could explain something, we could have examples, we could walk through, we could give you feedback, but there are always going to be certain variables, certain thoughts and certain patterns and certain habits that you bring to the table that affect that. So even if it feels on the surface like we're on the same page, we might not exactly be on the same page. And so those tiny little variations can actually have an impact in terms of your ability to learn the technique properly and progress through. And so to remediate that, we need a method of practicing that makes you, the learner, very aware of the possible deviations so that you can catch them, because it's just not going to be possible for someone else to catch them. Even if I was to look at you, 24/7, and look for any possible issues, there are going to be some things that only happen inside your head that only you can be aware of, that you're going to need to catch yourself on. And so we teach you the method of practice that we've designed, modified of various other practice frameworks that we've found are specifically designed to cue you in to finding possible areas of weakness or misinterpretation or mistakes that you're making that you may not be aware of. So you'll learn this method of practice. It happens relatively early on in the course, but if you don't practice in that way, you'll probably still improve, but at a certain point, you will probably stop improving quite as much, or you may just stop improving altogether. And that, again, is very frustrating because you can practice and practice and practice, and it doesn't feel like anything is happening. It can be a very disheartening process, and that's usually because of the fact that the method of practice is not actually picking up on these errors. And again, it's insight limiting. We wouldn't even know what those areas of weakness are until you start engaging in that process. And then once you start practicing the right way, we can then work with you again because there's more data, there's more information, so we can help you with that problem solving process. So those are the two things that would make a really, really big difference in terms of how long you can expect to spend on the course to master everything. However, there is also the aspect of consistency that I talked about. When I talk about consistency, I'm talking about, again, learning all the foundations properly in the right way, getting a good level of competency before moving on. But it's also talking about something that we call tug of war practice. We have found this to be increasingly common, especially among students that are very fixed in certain habits of studying. We found this with students that are very, very obsessed with linear note-taking or extremely invested in one system like Zettelkasten, for example, of note-taking. Because there are these existing habits, there is a natural tendency to use those habits when we're studying. Sometimes we are aware of that. We're sort of aware that we're reverting back to something because we don't want to use a new technique that we've learned. Or we're not even aware of that because we go into it with the intention of using a new technique. And as we do it, we sort of end up sort of subconsciously reverting. Our cognitive processes are not really what is being taught. It might look similar on paper, but we're sort of thinking in the same old way, just dressing it up in the new kind of note-taking structure or reading structure or whatever it is that we're teaching you. That is what we call tug of war practice, because what's necessary as part of this is cognitive retraining. We need to reprogram the natural tendencies and habits that you are using when you're studying. So when you're reverting back to old processes, it prevents your brain from having the pressure to change and retrain the way that it's used to thinking. So if you're spending sort of half the time using a new technique and then half the time using the old technique, you can see that your brain isn't really going to be retraining itself as effectively as it could be. So that's just one thing to be aware of. And again, the method of practice that we're going to teach you is designed in such a way that it cues you in to being more aware of those types of tendencies. So if you are starting to do this tug of war practice, the method of practice that we teach you should pick up on that. So you should be able to catch yourself before it becomes an issue. But don't be disheartened, because even though I say 4 to 8 months, it's not as if it takes 4 months to start seeing an effect. You will start seeing effects and benefits from really your first few days, because we're teaching you things at a foundation level to begin with. So for some people that completely lack those foundation, they'll see very significant, quite dramatic improvements in just the first sort of week or two. And actually, if you read some of our reviews and testimonials, you'll see that some of those are written by people that have only been on the course for like a couple of weeks. So if you're lacking a couple of these foundations, which again, I said most people are lacking at least one, you'll see a pretty big improvement in a certain domain straight off the bat. If you already have a really, really solid set of foundations, you may only find that that first area is improving things for you by only 5 or 10%. But it's still 5 or 10% better than where you were before. Or it may make you refocus and reprioritize on something that you kind of do, but you're not really doing as actively as we recommend that you should do. So those little optimizations are really important for just setting a really firm foundation. As you progress through the course even further and we learn more techniques, the improvement becomes much more predictable. In the beginning, people come with all these different methods of thinking and all these different ideas around learning. So the results in the early month is variable. as you go through and those thoughts are refined and developed further and further, the results are more predictable because there aren't these wild fluctuations from all these differing kind of practices. And so in the later stages, sort of now we're talking about after the first month leading up to the sort of 4 to 8 month period, we should start seeing gentle linear improvements in the studying process with a few kind of jumps here and there as you hit each new milestone. So it's not a binary thing. It's not like you will just struggle for 4 to 8 months and then suddenly you're going to be good. You're just going to be progressively getting better and better and better. We're just saying that it will take 4 to 8 months for you to get to a level of mastery where we would say, yes, you've actually learned the techniques to a good level of competency. To fully master it to the point where it's essentially perfect, you just add a few more months onto that. So let me now go into the big picture of how everything is set up. And again, if it feels overwhelming, then don't worry too much. You can come back to this as much as you need to. So very simplistically, we are viewing this process here, where there is information that's coming in, and then that information is going to then be processed. And not only is it going to be processed, we're processing it in such a way that it allows us to have retention and retrieval. So we can really say that if we haven't achieved retention and retrieval, then we haven't achieved effective learning. Now, it's about more than this because retention has different levels. There's different levels of depth to which we're able to understand something, and that's going to be reflected at the different levels at which we're able to retrieve something. So for example, just recalling a fact is going to be at a different level of retrieval depth than utilizing that for very complex problem solving with multiple other concepts. And the process through which we are processing the information will affect the ability for us to retrieve it at those levels. But on top of that, we're also looking at the self-management strategies and skills to be able to engage in these processes effectively. As a common example, if you are a serious procrastinator, it doesn't really matter how good your techniques are for studying. If you never study, you're never going to use those techniques. So we also look at the self-management strategies that enable you to use these techniques and strategies day in, day out, not being affected by the distractions or procrastinations or time management tendencies. So that's the big picture of what we're going to go through. So if you take nothing away from this, just think, what is this course teaching me and how does it fit into there? Is this helping me with the processing? Is it helping with the self-management? Is it helping me with the information retention and retrieval? Or is it helping me with a combination of all three? And you can have ideas about that. What I'm now going to do is I'm going to break this up a little bit more and go through a little bit more in detail so you have a better idea about how the system is meant to work. So the problem here is that most people are not really aware of the process around how retention and retrieval occur. They sort of just think about retention and retrieval and it's just this binary outcome. It either happened or it didn't happen. And you usually find out in an exam if you're a student or when your boss or supervisor or coworker gives you an odd look if you're a professional and you just don't know your stuff properly. And so the solution to that is putting a greater attention onto the actual process. And a good example of where this really goes out of control is something like flashcards, which is a very, very common method of learning with just something called spaced repetition, which is actually called spaced retrieval in the proper terminology for it. So something like spacing and the spacing effect, which is the cognitive effect responsible for spaced retrieval, is something that we found in lab studies to be effective in short-term intervals in a very isolated set of circumstances. But again, those of you that are very deeply familiar with the research on this will actually know that the way that people are recommended to use spaced repetition and flashcards in popular media, YouTube, by social media influencers, even by some schools and universities, is very out of proportion to what the research actually says. What the research doesn't say, has never looked at, is what it is like for real students facing authentic academic pressure. So namely, what we're talking about here is that we do not know if this type of strategy is effective if you have multiple subjects, you've got time pressured assessments with multiple assessments pressuring you at the same time, when you have to have a level of knowledge mastery that is deeper than just fact recall. So for example, problem solving or using multiple concepts together. And we don't know if that's effective long term. So most of the studies are only looking at it in terms of minutes or hours after learning it to see whether you're able to retain it or not. And a lot of the studies are just doing just word pairs. There's just irrelevant pieces of information. And so it's kind of been taken from that research, which has said it's been effective for these instances, and then people have sort of started recommending it without any of those limitations in place. And so the latest research that's coming out is starting to show that it's not really having consistent results. Now that lots of people are using it, we're seeing that most people that use this are not getting the results that it's meant to have. It's very time consuming. It takes time away from other things in their studying that they could be doing that could even be more beneficial. So right now we know that it is effective for some instances, but the way that it's being used is grossly disproportionate to how effective it actually is. And so if all you know is that's the only sort of piece of strategy or theory that you know, and someone is saying like me, that's not going to work for you, then that's very destabilizing. And so instead of focusing on just the technique, it's more important to think about the principle behind the technique, because then we can start adapting it. Even if the technique doesn't work, we can modify it in a way that does work. And this is very important for you as you progress through the program. You have to learn the techniques, but also the principles underneath it, so that after you finish the program, you don't have to just continually watch the videos to learn how to do the technique again. You can, again, be the mechanic of your own brain. You can problem solve these things more authentically yourself without needing so much external input. You can kind of go off of what we call first principles, which is logically figuring it out based on the knowledge that you know. And we see the same problem like we saw with flashcards. We see the same thing with note-taking. There are so many methods of note-taking that are recommended, but actually, when you look at the research on note-taking, none of those methods have really been shown to be effective in real-world settings. Same thing with homework. We know from research that doing homework across an entire school seems to improve achievement rates, but we don't really think that it helps students that are already doing okay to do even better, and we don't actually see that same effect at an individual level. So what that means is that there's a lot more going on behind the scenes that these studies are maybe not really looking at. And they will probably start looking at them over the next 10 to 20 years. But right now, if you're really focusing on just getting results for yourself in real world practice, we need to have a nuanced view of what the research tells us, as well as what practice and experience tells us. And so we're here to kind of bridge those things together, because obviously we are knowledgeable and have a lot of experience in both of those domains. Because the worst case scenario is really for you to use a technique that doesn't produce a certain result, and therefore you need another technique just to fix the symptom of the first one, and then that is another result, and then you need another technique to fix that one. And that is actually what's happening. There are people that are studying techniques that are fundamentally heading in the wrong direction. It's going to cause some good effects, but a huge host of bad effects as well. And then instead of just changing the direction to another strategy that has less bad things and more of the good things, we just add new techniques onto it. So let's say we're writing notes in a bad way, and so this is wasting time, and we're not having a great memory, and we're not able to retrieve it in an effective way, and we don't have a good depth of knowledge mastery. So because we're not able to retain it, we add on all these flashcards, and that helps us to retain some of the information. But because we can't have a deeper level of knowledge mastery, we start doing more and more practice questions. And because now our depth of knowledge is directly related to the number of practice questions we do, we just need more and more and more practice questions until we are doing, thousands and thousands of questions. But now we don't have any time to do anything else, so we're sacrificing on our sleep. So in order to make sure that we're getting enough sleep, we're having to cut out all of our hobbies and other things, and that's actually reducing our overall cognitive effectiveness. And so to make up for that, we're thinking about what we need to eat better in order to enhance our cognitive function, or what we need to do to what game we need to play to do that. And then that's cognitively exhausting in itself, and so that's making us procrastinate more and get more distracted. So now we have a whole other range of issues. So you can see how each band-aid solution is only really fixing it short term, but it's kind of making the whole thing worse. So when we designed the system, that was very front and center in our mind, in terms of we cannot let that happen, because that's the worst case scenario. So we sort of just wiped the slate clean and said, well, what do we need to do to make sure that this process, which is the core of effective learning, happens smoothly with as few of those negative side effects as possible. And so that's why the system that we teach is extremely novel. It's just it's very different to the conventional methods of learning. But again, actually, once you learn it, you'll probably find that it's very natural and very logical. And you'll look at the old way that you studied and think, that it doesn't even make sense why that even was a method of studying that existed in the first place. That's often what a lot of our students will say. So when we think about information in, we can divide that into a few processes. So we need to be able to scope the information, we need to be able to evaluate the information, and then we need to be able to make a plan based on those evaluations. So at this point, there are a few things that we need to be considering. We need to be considering the depth of the resources that we are using, the language that it's using, and how appropriate it is for our learning needs. Normally, when we're scoping information and we're trying to normally we're not even scoping or evaluating the information at all. We just dive into it, head first. The reason that scoping is important is because it allows us to create a plan in terms of how we can draw on information. And this reduces certain negative cognitive effects that can hold you back in the later stages. It sort of lubricates the overall experience of learning because we're not having to stop and exert cognitive resources in figuring out where to get the answer to certain things. Another benefit that it has is that it allows us to form knowledge schemas a little bit more quickly and more efficiently across a broader range, because it's allowing us to see the extent at which relationships and schemas can be formed rather than it being limited to a single class or a single lecture. And that's extremely important. Once we start limiting it to a single class or a single lecture, we are artificially blocking out a lot of those relationships that we could be forming. That means that our schema is going to be smaller. And the detriment of a smaller schema is that it means that there are less things for us to leverage off in our future learning. The more you know, the easier it is to learn more things. It's very difficult to learn something that's more advanced if you lack the basic understanding. And the same is the case for a single lecture. Having something in lecture 5 may help you to learn something in lecture 1. You may not need to know it in depth, but even just knowing that it exists and the general nature of that relationship makes a big difference. And so some of the techniques that we'll teach you will be about either scoping it accurately, because we have to think about, is this the appropriate resource? Do we need to use this? Do we not need to use this? And make a decision about that. We then need to make a decision about what we're doing with what we scoped. What is important? How do we decide what is important? How do we decide what is timely? And then creating a plan. And then being able to do all of this in a time-efficient manner without it being like an entire study session by itself, because that obviously defeats the purpose of it being time-efficient. So these are the things that we think about here. Once we've created a plan, we've scoped everything out, then we can move on to the act of really processing it. Now, from a cognitive point of view, we've actually already started processing it in these early stages. Once we started scoping through the information, our brain started worrying and trying to form some of these knowledge schemas. Again, if we were thinking and processing that information in the right way. But now we're going to kick it up a notch. We're going to take those raw materials and we're going to start really building a few things. So the considerations here that we want to tick off, where our attention is and where our focus is. So there's a lot of information that we can be consuming, especially across an entire topic if you're studying sort of multiple lectures at the same time. And so bringing your attention just from the beginning all the way through to the end is not often a great order in which to learn the information, because again, there are going to be sort of fundamental milestones that if you could unlock those, it speeds up the entire rest of the process. So your job is really to find where those milestones are as quickly as possible and get those kind of landmark posts in your brain, and then start linking those together to form a very big picture overall scaffold and knowledge schema. And so the method through which we do that is fairly specific, because if we read a heading, we have to make a decision about, is it important or not? It could say it's important in the textbook, but then in another textbook, maybe that's not the heading. So in that case, which is more important? Or maybe it's actually something else, a bold word, or maybe it's an entire paragraph that you choose to turn into a keyword. We have to make a decision about which method is going to produce a landmark that is the most efficient. And again, we have to do that in a time-efficient manner. And it depends, again, on the topic. It depends on your familiarity with it. One of the things that we can do to make that a little bit faster is really look for what we call analogous relationships. Analogous relationships are using our prior knowledge to help us understand new information more quickly. The considerations here are that we don't want to be influenced in a negative way by those analogous relationships. So again, there are techniques and systems in terms of how we can leverage our prior knowledge without making us biased in the new information that we learn and therefore learn it incorrectly. So for example, you may have something new that you learn that feels very similar to something else that you already know. And if that is not actually accurate, that would have a negative effect on your schema formation, which you then have to spend time and resources later to correct yourself on. Usually because you realize that you got a test question wrong, or you don't really understand how something works, and now you have to reflect back and think something went wrong, where did it go wrong? That's a very time-consuming process. In some cases, it's not even possible to really correct that, which is why some misunderstandings can be prevalent and persist in your brain for years and years and years and years, going completely unchallenged. We want to use analogous relationships to speed up that pattern recognition and to be able to learn new information more quickly, but we also want to do it in a way that holds us back from being too overzealous with that process and making relationships that we really shouldn't have made. So there's a balance there in terms of the critical thinking. And again, there are techniques and systems that will teach you in order to do that. In the early stages, it'll look just like leveraging off of prior knowledge in very, very simple ways. Just getting used to the habit of drawing off prior knowledge to start hypothesizing on connections. And then the next stage after that, we teach you how you can take those hypotheses and start prioritizing the possible relationships in terms of which one has a higher likelihood of being accurate. And in the stage after that, we're looking at how do we prioritize the more accurate ones to the one that is going to be the most time efficient for us and is going to serve us the best for whatever retrieval purposes that we need to use it for. And that series actually occurs through multiple stages where you learn that progressively as you go. Obviously, you're not going to be able to do the later version of that technique without being very, very familiar with working through those analogous relationships at a basic level first. And ultimately, what this is going to allow us to do is have what we've been talking about is that knowledge schema creation. Those of you that are well-versed in educational theory know that knowledge schema, the word schema is quite a technical term, but actually there are things to do with what is called schema theory that are a little bit complicated and don't necessarily really fit into what I'm talking about right now. So I'm talking about the word schema in a more general sense. I'm talking about a general model of thinking, a general scaffold. In the program, we often use the word backbone to refer to the overall structure in which we can think about information. The schema is very important because we have to develop the schema to be able to develop sub-schemas and to advance our knowledge even further. Without having a good understanding of how we need to think about the information, it becomes very hard to assign relevance to the information. After all, if information comes in and our brain doesn't know how to think about it, why would it hold on to that information? In fact, it doesn't. It's a waste of energy, and so it's very efficient at removing that. Overcoming that is our primary goal. We are manually, forcibly asserting significance and relevance to information for new information that we may not really care much about, and tricking our brain to holding on to it and not bidding it so freely. And that relies on forming a schema that was able to give relevance to that information. So all of these things allow us to create that schema. In the early stages of your technique, what you're going to learn is how we can start forming a schema. Any kind of schema. And we're going to get experience at how different types of schemas have different effects on our memory and different effects on our experience of learning more detailed and advanced knowledge. As we continue to progress through, you're going to learn about how you can prioritize those schemas and then how you can use methods of note-taking to facilitate the creation of those schemas and actually be more accurate and faster at creating those schemas than if you didn't have that particular note-taking strategy. So that's what comes in next, is how do we use note-taking, the act of just physically representing our ideas, to facilitate and enhance the cognitive processes rather than holding it back. There are lots of things to think about here, even things like the color you use, the spatial arrangement, where you've put it, where you decide to put it, the type of arrows you use, even font size and the width, whether you write it versus whether you type it. All of these things actually have a small but cumulatively significant influence on the learning outcome and the schema formation. So in the early stages, you're going to learn techniques on note-taking. If you're a traditionally very linear note-taker, it's going to allow you to open up and just express ideas at a greater level of depth. Linear note-taking is very, very locked in. Expressing relationships of even just 3 different things together is very wordy and time-consuming. And if you've got, let's say, 7 different ideas that are all interrelated together, trying to explain that through words is very, very tedious, and it's very hard to read through and understand it again afterwards. So we're going to be using non-linear note-taking structures. We're going to teach you some very basic ways to use that note-taking to enhance certain key cognitive features such as getting higher quality chunking, such as propelling your analogous relationship formation. Then the next stage is how to clean up that note-taking technique, remove some of the redundancy, speed things up a little bit more, and really start optimizing it. At that point, you've already really got a 50 to 60% of all the benefit that you're going to get from that. And in the later stages after that, we're just continually refining and optimizing it. So there's still a lot of improvement that can be had, but these early stages are important for just getting that basic new habit of associating what happens in our brain and the relationships and the thought process with what we're actually writing down, and then creating that feedback loop. So that takes a period of weeks just to get that association down. And then we can refine that. And the best thing about this is because your note taking will be so closely matched to your thinking process, it makes it much easier for us to help you by diagnosing the problems. We can see your work and we can say, if you truly did have a congruent note-taking technique, you would have not drawn this here unless you thought in this particular way. And then so when we bring that up to you, it's a lot easier to have that discussion and diagnosis because it allows us to directly observe and measure the learning process that's occurring, at least a little bit more clearly than just kind of watching your eyes and expression and just hearing your subjective experience about it. Now, there's a few other things that we need to think about here in terms of how do we actually start integrating all those fine details that we'd need to know, and they're very small specifics. That's obviously important in terms of like examinations and assessments, but it can really screw up with everything else because details are so compelling and there's so much of it that if we're not good at managing those details and we're not good at prioritizing where to put it, how to express it, how to integrate it, and how to change our knowledge schemas to compensate for them, depending on which information source it came from, at what stage of the learning you were doing this, and how important it is for you to actually hold on to that information. If we're not managing that properly, our notes and our schema can just blow open out of proportion because in terms of sheer volume, there is just so many details. So it's a very careful thing that we need to be very attentive to and very deliberate in how we're processing that information. So in the early stages, we don't really touch that at all. Really, we just mostly advise you to use various small memorization aids. We utilize things like flashcards, things that are very easy to do. They're not the most effective way of doing it, but allows us to manage it to an acceptable level until we build these other skills. Once the other skills are more solid, we're then going to teach you more advanced methods of integrating that information. But it's important that we're not integrating that at an earlier stage because it can make it so much harder to develop the more core skills that I've been talking about so far. Once we've processed this in the right way, we should naturally see that we are having a higher level of retention and our retrieval is to a greater level of depth. That should be a natural consequence of the process that we're doing. And it makes a lot of sense that the outcome in our brain depends on the process in our brain. So that is indeed what happens. However, there are still things that we can do to optimize this. And specifically, that's in the way that we practice the retrieval and things like spacing. So when it comes to something like spacing, what we see is that the spacing intervals and the amount that we have to go through with each space retrieval varies massively depending on how good the process was beforehand and how well we manage the details. So a key sign of someone that didn't learn all the previous steps correctly would be that they're still getting overwhelmed with how much they need to repeat on a constant or frequent basis. That suggests that there was a management of the details and knowledge schema at an earlier level that was still not cognitively optimized. And therefore, they're having to overcompensate for them with just repetition. So that's a sign that we can go back to and then start optimizing a few things a little bit further. However, if we do have it well optimized, we want to think about how we're spacing them out. And aspect that often people don't think about very much is when we're spacing them out in the context of even like a single day. So people think a lot about the spacing interval, how long the gap needs to be between each retrieval session. However, many people don't think about what they can do in little gaps and pockets of time. So 2 minutes here, 3 minutes here, 5 minutes here throughout the day. It's very difficult to utilize that time if you have a high dependency on these space retrieval sessions because you've got so much to cover in a short period of time. But if you have a good knowledge schema and if you've managed the details correctly, there are some parts of information that can be consolidated very effectively by using tiny pockets of time that would not normally be accessible throughout the day. And this is a concept called micro-learning that we have sort of adapted, and we've found that certain parts of that fit very well with this current schema of doing things. The other thing that we need to think about is interleaving. Now, interleaving is quite a big topic, but it involves sort of breaking up your revision sessions and your study sessions so that it isn't a single massed block, and with each attempt looking at it from different angles and challenging yourself in different ways. And we've found that interleaving is something that is actually very easy to learn. It's very easy to do. It produces a very powerful immediate cognitive effect, and it kind of weirdly doesn't even matter how good you are at any of the other stuff. If you do that, you get an immediate improvement. Obviously, if you do the other stuff well, the improvement is more, but just doing it produces a huge benefit, which is why it's one of the first things that you're actually going to learn is all the different ways that you can do good interleaving to produce these very, very good effects. And as you do more of the interleaving, you actually start getting better at the processing of it as well, because your brain starts learning new patterns of thinking. So it helps with the encoding and re-encoding cycle. Now, on top of this, we have to think about how all of this is going to feed back into what we're actually doing. So the results and the data that we get from here is important for us to infer how good we did all the previous steps before this. So if we didn't do the processing well, we may see that there are issues with our retention or our retrieval later on. So we have to make a decision about what is the issue that we are seeing, how significant is the issue that we are seeing, and what does the issue actually mean in terms of our process. We have to have that sort of diagnostic eye. We can't be binary about this. We can't say there is an issue, something went wrong. Even though that's true, that doesn't really help us because there's so many things that could have gone wrong. So we need to be more specific in terms of this went wrong, and therefore it's most likely to be this, this, or this. And then you can use the method of practice that we teach you to start diagnosing and problem solving that in a very effective and time efficient way. So those of you that are familiar with some of my YouTube videos, you may see me talking about certain aspects of this here and there, but they're talked about on YouTube much more superficially because of the fact that, no one can be bothered to watch like a huge video of like 6 hours talking about a single technique just to do it the right way. In the course, it's going to go through it in a lot more depth. But the other thing is that there's a lot of variation with each of the steps as well. So for example, let's talk about just note taking, because that's something that often people are very curious about. I teach a method of note taking, which is very, very specific, where you can make for example, a mind map looking structure, and it may seem relatively simple. And so you may be tempted to just go and try to do that straight off the bat to the best of your ability. And there's no problem with giving it a go. But the problem is in assuming that because it looks a little similar, that it was actually the right process if all the other background stuff wasn't there. So, for example, one of the things that you're going to learn very, very early on that we develop across the entire course is the ability to group information in a meaningful way. Grouping information is easy. Really, anyone can group information. Grouping information in the best way for your memory, for your retrieval and retention is very, very difficult because there are so many ways that information can be grouped, because the way you group information affects the way you group the rest of the information. That affects the relationships that you form. That affects your knowledge schema. And that affects everything else. That affects the details that you're going to manage. But then on the other hand, the way you manage your details affects what information you think is more or less important, which is going to affect the way that you're going to group the information. So if you manage your details incorrectly, and then therefore you misattributed something as more important than it really is, and therefore you group something in the wrong way, it's very difficult to notice that and then regroup it. So when we're grouping it, there are a lot of things that we are thinking about. In the early stages, we're going to teach you very, very simple grouping just to get used to grouping information. This will be a very easy process for most people, and it will already start having some benefits. One of the most challenging things that we're going to teach you, especially in the early to mid stages of the course, is exactly how to group information in a way that is perfectly cognitively optimized. And this is one of the very unique things that we discovered kind of almost by accident. And then once we started noticing it, we dove into it extensively, and we looked at all the research around why this could be happening. And so it aligns very closely with concepts that we call chunking, as well as the theory of cognitive load theory. And we've created this sort of system of how you can create a cognitively optimized group. But the way that you do that is extremely, extremely specific, to the point where there's really no possible way that you can do it right the first go, partly because of the fact that it actually takes a certain number of mistakes to start even being aware of what the right way even looks like. So we often find with people that are not practicing sufficiently that they think they have learned it, but then they decide the technique is not effective because they're not getting the results. But actually, the problem is that they didn't learn the technique properly, and they think the technique's not effective because they're not using the right technique. But again, it's insight limiting. So they don't know that they're doing it the wrong way. So it's kind of like a chicken and egg situation. You need to know what you don't know to realize that you did it the wrong way. And so our approach and our advice for this is don't fall into that trap to begin with. Start by learning it slowly and getting lots of feedback so that each component is right. And once all the ingredients are of high quality, when we bring them together, it should produce a predictable result. And if it doesn't, the types of mistakes are also predictable. But if the materials, if each ingredient is a little bit off, when we put it together, we're going to start getting unpredictable problems where trying to see where it went wrong is essentially impossible. You're going to have a bad experience. You're not going to have good results. We're not going to have good experience. And no one wins in that situation. Really, no one wins. And it's going to take you so much more time to then learn it again properly. So please don't do that. And then finally, coming up here, we've got the self-management strategies. So when it comes to self-management, we're thinking about things like focus, procrastination, and distractions, how distractible you are. We're thinking about things like motivation and consistency and time, as well as task management. And all of these things affect each other. You know, your level of focus affects your procrastination, which affects your motivation, and your motivation affects your procrastination, which affects your level of focus, and the time and task management affects your motivation and your procrastination. All of these things affect each other. But we can break this down a little bit further. So when it comes to something like focus, we're going to be looking at how you are triggering focus, how you're creating routines of focus, how you're optimizing your environment, where your attention is in terms of what you think produces focus versus what really produces focus, and methods to start evaluating that by yourself. Likewise, very similar for procrastination. We need to understand what the triggers for procrastination are. We need to be very in tune with what our habits are in terms of why we procrastinate, how we procrastinate, and the cognitive chain that occurs. And then we can start working on strategies that will break those cognitive chains, make it easier to stop procrastinating, and eventually make it so that not procrastinating becomes a new habit. And that obviously has flow-on effects with your focus and distractibility as well. When it comes to something like motivation, we're now thinking about how much dependency you have on willpower and motivation, how fluctuant your productivity is based on your motivation, what are the extrinsic versus intrinsic sources of motivation, and how you're managing both of those, and therefore how you can optimize both of those and create systems that are, number one, more habit dependent, and number two, less motivation dependent overall, where habits form part of that. But the other aspect is how your processes themselves are going to drive motivation and allow you to hold that motivation in reserve so that it's not constantly being drained and exhausted. And then when it comes to time and task management, we're thinking about a range of different things. One of the most important things being how you prioritize and the frameworks through which you prioritize, whether you prioritize actively, and how you decide whether something is important or not important. And you'll learn that there are some methods of thinking that make us think something is important, but actually another method of thinking would make us realize that it's actually not as important as we thought it was. And so we're going to teach you some of those things, and then how you can integrate those seamlessly into things like time blocking and time management, and some of the overrated parts about time management that take more time to set up than it would give and free up for you. So some traps when it comes to time management, which is why some people can have amazing schedules or be trying to schedule every single day for years and still feel like they've got problems with time management. These are a lot of the traps that you can run into. So obviously there's a lot to talk about, and believe it or not, I'm really just scratching the surface. I could talk about any single aspect of this for probably a couple hours just on that alone, at least. So all of this stuff is taught in the course, and you can see how everything is going to relate to each other. So when I talked about those foundations and building everything in a way that you're able to really learn it, I'm talking about this sequence. By the time you finish this program, you're going to know how to do all of this. And you're going to know the optimum way to do every single component of what I talked about. and you're going to feel the results for yourself. But if you're in such a rush to try to learn everything without getting the foundations, you're going to find it's not a good time. Okay. So again, we know that 100% from the data that we've collected from thousands of students from around the world of all different levels, 100% of the students that have followed the instructions and have gone through the course have found a benefit of some level. Over 80% have found a dramatic, game-changing level of impact. So I want you to keep this in mind, is that when you go through the program for yourself and you start kind of understanding a little bit more about the techniques and you're starting to apply them, if you get to a point where you're feeling, I'm not actually getting any benefit from this, there is a very, very strong sign, almost guaranteed actually, that there is some aspect of the way that you're practicing or progressing through the program that is slightly, maybe subtly deviating from what is recommended. So at that time, at the earliest possible time, when you notice this is not really as good as it should be, please send through your approach and your work to get feedback. And when you send it through for feedback, we will be able to see and give you advice and help you work through that process. But it's important to be open-minded. You're in this program so that you can really learn these skills. There's no point coming into it thinking you already know everything and having these very, very fixed ideas about what you need to do and how you need to develop it. Trust us, we are the experts at doing this. If there was a better way, we would do it. But through our close observation, we have found that this is the most effective way to teach you. I mean, if your brain is exploding at this stage, that's fine. It's expected. There's a lot. It was overwhelming. There's heaps of stuff that we talked about. But you can refer to this again and again and again to see how each of the techniques that we teach you will fit into this. So hopefully, with this in mind, you won't feel tempted to sprint through and access later techniques or not practice the current techniques that you're currently working on because you think they're irrelevant or they're too easy or whatever ideas that you might have. Really, the whole point of this entire video is so that you just practice what is in front of you, because if you do, and if you can master just what is immediately in front of you as you naturally progress through the... So let's take a look back and just reflect for a little bit in terms of how far we've come and look at the entire study system that we have begun to develop and hopefully forming into a habit now. What I want you to do is take a piece of paper and I want you to be writing down any elements that you think you've slacked off on or you've forgotten about, or areas that you need to really just in general focus on and emphasize more for the weeks to come. This full study system is what you really need to be doing to be getting those top grades. And if you're able to follow these guidelines, then you should have a pretty easy time of achieving that as well. So I'll go through from pretty much top to bottom, covering everything that we need to be incorporating. And if you're missing even one of these things, then there's going to be a noticeable disadvantage and you are increasing your risk of making certain types of mistakes. So have that piece of paper and write your notes as you go to make sure that you're checking off all of these things. So the first thing that we need to make sure is recapping on our fundamentals, right? So we know that we need to have a good amount of spacing. We need to have interleaving. We need to have a good method and frequency for retrieval. And then we need to have a few other guidelines around note taking and things like that, which we'll get to soon. So let's go through spacing first. So in terms of spacing, we should be having a good spaced revision schedule. You could be using any combination of the schedules that we've covered already so far in the course, or you could be doing the general rule of thumb, 1 day, 1 week, 1 month type thing, or a midweek one if you're a university student and you've got lots to study. We should be following basic guidelines of doing pre-study, and the pre-study that we're doing should be topic-wide. And we then would go and learn it in class on a daily basis / in your lecture. And this repeats every single day. So this is not topic-wide anymore. This is obviously just daily. And then after your class or your lecture, you would be doing your same day review.
And the content that you'll be going over again is just the daily. And then you'd do optionally your midweek revision. And this is obviously now for the couple of days worth. So this is probably 2 to 3 days of content. And then we should have our end of week. Now your end of week should ideally also be topic wide, because you'll be covering it at that pace. If your end of week is not topic wide, it might be half the topic, but ideally we want to do it so that our end of week revision is topic wide, or as close to topic wide as is feasible or reasonable. If you're in school, especially the younger levels where a single topic could take you weeks or even months, then you can break this up so it's not topic wide, but maybe quarterly or something like that. If you're a university student, you're usually doing around a topic per week or so. So we can do a topic wide revision at the end of the week. The next one is the end of month review, and the end of month will be multi-topic wide. And then we've got our pre-test reviews, which is entire subject wide, or at least up until the area that you're getting assessed on, at least. So that's your basic spacing that we need to be doing. And then through all of this, we need to be interleaving, as you guys already know. We should be interleaving all of this stuff constantly. All of the techniques, all of the spacing that we're doing should always be interleaved, but you guys should already obviously know that by now. So all of this stuff is interleaved. When we're doing our pre-study, because we're doing that topic-wide, we can be using our BHS aim shoot cycle. Here we're aiming to get around coverage of layer 1+2 of learning at least. This is our goal here. And you can go even into bits of layer 3 if you really wanted to and you had the time, but at the very least you want to be going through layer 1 and 2 during that time. There are other methods that you could be using depending on how refined your technique is, but the main one that we'll be using that we've gone through is just a simple aim shoot cycle without the need to skin yet. Remember that when we're doing that, we've got our relational priority, and we've also got our importance-based chunking. Okay, very important, obviously. And all of this is going to allow us to do a very high efficiency first pass encoding, right? So this is allowing us to create high efficiency first pass encoding. And that's obviously from your working memory to your long term, and that reduces the amount of forgetting that you have. On the lecture day for that day's material, we're consolidating here, and we're aiming for layer 2+3, maybe parts of 4, and you may be consolidating on your layer 1 as well. We want to make sure that we are making our relationships at this stage are now accurate and very explicit. We don't want to just say, oh, they are linked together, because that's very weak. We want to know exactly what that relationship is and how that compares with other relationships. And then later that day, on our same day revision, when we're consolidating, we're really cleaning this. We're doing an addition. So for example, we're adding on the layer 3+4. And then at this stage, we can choose to skin the mind map. And this is a great time to do it. And obviously all the auxiliary details that we're getting from textbooks, all of that sort of stuff will come in here as well. And at this point, we should really have around about 90 to 100% of the entire topic pretty well understood. And then we can also add on our memorization aids. So we can be introducing seamlessly modified method of loci plus minus flashcards with active flashcard management techniques on top of that, which should make it reasonably manageable and not overwhelming. Okay, so we've done the pre-study, we've done the class and lecture, we've done the same day revision, and you notice that at each step it's
slightly interleaving it. The technique that we're using may be variation of aim and shoot and then going through skin, but the BHS system is inherently naturally interleaving. So just by following the BHS, you're actually interleaving it. So the next one will be the midweek revision, if you are doing the midweek revision. And the midweek one, at this point, we've already skinned it. So doing the same thing again is going to be lower yield. So at this point, this is really revision number 1 after the pre-study and the lecture or the class material. And one example of what we could be doing here is our creating challenge questions. We could be doing challenge questions. We could even do a mini brain dump for just that day's worth of information, and we could potentially make questions based on the weaknesses that we find from that. The idea here is that whatever we're doing, we're looking for gaps and weaknesses. We want to target those weaknesses as early in our revision cycle as possible. And again, these challenging questions, you can also swap these with friends to get a bit of diversity and just make it a little bit more interesting as well. Then comes our end of week revision. Our end of week revision, this is where we want to do our high volume retrieval practice. So that's obviously using things like brain dumps or whole part whole reteaching. I would opt for the whole part whole reteaching if you have the skill to do so, because it's a little bit broader and it's just assessing us at all the different levels of Bloom's taxonomy in a more seamless way. And it's going to allow you to pick up on those gaps and weaknesses much faster than doing a linear brain dump. However, if you've got the time, so for example, if you have an end of week revision and then let's say that you do a fortnightly revision as well, you could do a linear brain dump after that if you wanted to. And even your brain dump doesn't have to be linear necessarily. You could do a linear brain dump, or you could also do a mind map brain dump, like a mini mind map, semi-topic brain dump. So multiple different ways that you could do this. And then the next one, obviously after the end of week comes the end of month. And in your end of month, a great thing that you can do is actually be answering the questions that you've asked here. So this is now answering the challenge questions. You can do another type of high volume retrieval practice if you wanted to, like a linear or mind map brain dump. But another thing is, the good old-fashioned past papers, practice questions if they're available to you. If you're writing essays, practice essays. And again, we're abiding by the same principle. We're always looking for our gaps and weaknesses. We're trying to find the areas that we're not sure about rather than just going through it mindlessly. And then the final stage is just pre-test. And in the pre-test period, we want to get that stylistic way of answering questions and the ability to retrieve and recall and the way that they may be testing us. So generally speaking, past papers during this period are a good way, as well as, quizzing each other with your friends, things like that. And, you could implement group study strategies that we've covered at any point throughout this, right? So at any point throughout this, you could be using, and by any point throughout this, I mean any point after the pre-study, really, you could be using any of the group study strategies that we've covered. So now what about retrieval? So retrieval needs to be done well. And the way that we're going to make sure that we're doing retrieval well is all of the stuff that I've already mentioned here in terms of the spacing and the interleaving continually throughout. We need to make sure that our flashcards are being done in parallel to our mainstream of studying. So mainstream of studying basically includes all of the stuff that we've talked about here. This is all the mainstream of studying. All of this stuff is your mainstream of studying. So when are you doing the flashcards? Well, you're doing them whenever they're due in parallel. You're doing them in parallel, and we want to make sure that we're leveraging off of that micro learning style, not batch. We need to make sure we're doing it micro learning. And remember, we're using active recall, but don't use pseudo recall. We want to make sure that it is true active recall whenever we're doing it. And this also comes through again when we're doing our notes. So that's the other point that I want to make, is general guidelines around how we should be writing our notes at any given point. Our notes should have always a degree of chunking, and that chunking should be importance-based where possible. the layers 3 should go on your mind map, whereas your layer 4 should go on flashcards, plus minus other memorization tools, as well as bits of layer 3 that you think you're likely to forget. Flashcards, obviously, we're using all of our active flashcard management techniques, and they need to be digital. Remember, for all of those major reasons, and remember to follow the rule of 3, including the both variants of it, which is about what happens when you get it incorrect, and about how you can introduce more interleaving through modifying the question based on the rule of 3. So remember to do that, not just one of those. Your notes should be visualized. Okay, we're getting that hemispheric integration. We're wanting to make sure that we're using parts of our brain that aren't normally used in the learning process, especially the artistic and abstract representation and spatial arrangement of information. And then that's obviously going to come through with that modified method of loci that you're incorporating in there as well. So using different parts, leveraging off of spatial arrangement, leveraging off of the artistic parts of your brain, all of this stuff is going to really drive up that encoding efficiency higher as well, which is going to make your retrieval practice more effective. And obviously, by this point, it shouldn't even need to be said, but all of your notes need to be processed, okay? And everything that goes into processing your notes, make sure that we're always processing it, and we're using that brain power, we're optimizing that cognitive load as much as possible. We're not just going through passively. We're not finding it, it's so easy to just read this material and then yet have learned nothing at the end of it. We're making sure that we're using our brain power in order to process it, in order to do the chunking and to identify the layers and to create the relationships and to do the retrieval and the interleaving and the artistic expression. All of that stuff requires the input of brain power, okay, which is otherwise called cognitive load, and this needs to be maintained at all times. Your cognitive load should never really drop, and if it does, we're not really getting good learning out of it. So this is just a quick summary of everything that we need to be doing, and I haven't mentioned the obvious things that shouldn't even need to be said by now, like don't ever copy verbatim what the teacher says, don't just copy from a textbook, don't write notes without thinking about what you want to write first, don't write anything before mentally simplifying it first, like all of the really, really obvious things, the mistakes that most very low-level beginner students are making. You should be at a stage now where that is just completely obvious that you shouldn't be making those mistakes. But make sure that we've got both sides of the coin. We've got the encoding things, okay, using the aim shoot cycle and the skinning and the processing and the mind maps and the chunking and all of that sort of stuff. But make sure that we have the good spaced interleaved retrieval in there as well. We're not forgetting about that because, there are students out there who are horrible at their encoding and therefore they have a hard cap on their efficiency, but they do the spaced retrieval religiously. They're not even necessarily interleaving. They just do the spaced retrieval religiously, and they'll get pretty decent results. They'll need to spend a lot more time and effort, and it's a lot riskier doing it that way. But you, who now should have a really high level of encoding, you want to make sure that you are doing the spaced interleave retrieval as well to get the full level of benefit. And I know that at this point in your progress, you may be so sort of, I guess, like in love with the idea of this high efficiency encoding that we've been doing, that you can actually forget about the spaced interleaving retrieval and just making sure that we have the frequency and the spacing that we need. So see which areas that you missed, see if there's anything that you need to keep up with. I haven't talked about anything to do with maintaining your focus, optimize for focus rest timing. I haven't talked about, any of the stuff about focus training or removing distractions or our, habit building system. I haven't talked about any of that sort of stuff. This is just looking at the study system, making sure that we've covered most of our bases. As a little side note, what happens once you're able to do all of this? Well, again, we need to be working up our hierarchy, obviously, in terms of our hierarchy of competence. So once you get to a level of unconscious competence, So a lot of you are going to be at a level of unconscious competence for some of these. However, you're probably going to be sitting more around this area here, maybe still a little bit down here in the level of still incompetence. But, most of you will be around level of conscious competence for a lot of these aspects. So what happens here is that, number one, you need to drive towards a level of unconscious competence, because when you're at a level of unconscious competence, your speed that you're able to apply this technique to goes up massively. So you're able to get faster and faster at using the technique. The other thing is also your quality of, especially something like chunking, goes up a lot. So chunking may be something that's very easy and pretty much second nature for you right now. And even importance-based chunking may be second nature for you by now. Well, hopefully it is by this point. But the thing is that when you require a lot of energy input to doing good importance-based chunking, when the effort that's required is very high, then the level of chunking that you can get is only so good. So for example, if we had 6 different points, and with maximum effort we were able to chunk them into 3 different points, then over time, as your competency grows towards an unconscious level of competence, then we're able to chunk better and better, and that means that we can take these 3 chunks and we can get to this with very, very minimal effort, right? So now this becomes easy. But this is kind of a false sense of confidence, because this may not be the best level of chunking possible. And I see this a lot with my more intermediate, higher level students. When the chunking process is second nature, they still calibrate their sense for how good the chunking is based on how good they were able to be when they were still a beginner. And they measure how much better they've become based on how much easier it is to do it. But we need to actually, again, make sure that we're using our brain power and optimizing our cognitive load. If it's easy, we're not actually going to get as much learning out of it as we could be able to get. So don't make it easy. We want to get even better at chunking. So now it's challenging once again, but it's not challenging to get to this level, but it's challenging to maybe get to this level, where we've found another level of chunking on top of it. So as your competency grows, the quality, especially of things like chunking, especially of things like finding that relational importance, even techniques like modified method of loci and your integration of that, these things become higher and higher quality, which make your studying process simpler and simpler and faster, and makes your retention greater and greater as well. But you should never feel that the process of learning mentally doesn't require any brain power, because that means that you are failing in cognitive load. You need to actively maintain it. That's the active part of active learning. Just because you're good at active learning doesn't mean that you become passive again. Your active learning means that you just try harder and harder and harder. A really weak person tries really hard to lift 5 kilograms. A really strong person doesn't just settle for 5 kilograms. They try just as hard as a weak person, and they end up lifting 100 kilograms instead. So that's what you need to do. Don't be satisfied with lifting 5 kilograms. Be satisfied with lifting 100 kilograms. Keep things challenging. But then there's a stage after this as well. So once you are, you're continually driving that up and you're getting better and better, and all of these basic techniques that we've taught you are unconsciously competent, then the next step forward is about getting that real personalized adjustment. And that personalized adjustment is when you're taking various principles. So for example, you're taking the principle of interleaving, or you're taking the principle of microlearning, and you're driving up the amount of interleaving or the amount of microlearning that you're using in your system to suit your needs. So all of this is adjusting it for your own situation and for your own needs. So for example, when I work with competitive athletes, they often have a lot of training time. So they don't have time to just sit and study for a long period of time. They need to use a system that is much more micro-learning heavy. So their system is not going to look like this. It's not going to have the same type of spacing. It's not going to have even the same type of aim-shoot cycle. All of these techniques can then be adjusted to be more interleaving heavy or more micro-learning heavy, more relationally heavy. The multi-pass system is one that is designed for rapid sprints of burst studying. And that's an example of a small adjustment that can be made depending on your situation. But there are many other adjustments that can be made that are like that. So the next step is having a very deep understanding about some of the basic principles and the important principles that we've talked about, and how we can actually modify the techniques themselves to get the most out of that for different subjects, for different, times of the year, for different stages of life, for when we're busy in different ways, a lot of these different things. So all of this stuff can seem very overwhelming for a beginner. But you guys know that you've just diligently gone through the course, and so you should actually be pretty good at almost everything that I've talked about, hopefully. So you just need to work on this, unless there were things that you slacked off on or you missed out on in the earlier stages before that I was talking about over here. So if that's not the case, then well done. If you have found things that you need to work on, go and diligently work on that. Make sure that you are keeping up with your COBS, experiential learning cycle, to drive up that improvement in the fastest possible way. And, just take a bit of time and reflect back on before you started this course and how little you really knew, and yet probably how much you thought you knew about how to study, and potentially how overconfident you were. Someone would have told you, hey, you can study, 5 times faster, and you would have thought, man, you're full of it. But just take a moment to reflect back on how far you've come, and there's just that much more improvement to come still. You're still early on in that journey. I've been doing this now for 10 years, and the journey is continuing. I'm still finding ways to get faster and more efficient all the time. And remember that your challenges are going to grow as well. Next year is going to be harder than this year. The year after is going to be harder than that. You will need to learn and adapt and consolidate and get better and better as time goes on. So, this, what may seem like something that is completely overwhelming for a beginner, for you guys, well done. You are at the summit, you're at the top, and you've just got some further gains to look forward to.